Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing our Spider-Man week coverage, we pick up with Ultimate Spider-Man and the origin of Miles Morales is the best way to say it. Miles Morales appeared before this particular origin, but he was really just kind of like a kid who was there, and that was really about it. And this is interesting because this brings in really to like Spider-Man Homecoming, the idea of Miles Morales. This video is being made 2 weeks before Spider-Man Homecoming, so I have no idea what goes on in that movie. But I would surmise that Miles Morales will probably appear in the movie, but either he'll be a post-credit scene or he'll just be a kid who's mentioned, and that'll be about it. And the reason why that works is because of the fact that that's what happened in the Ultimate Universe. This whole origin came after Miles Morales first appeared. Prior to this, he was just a kid who was there, and that was really it. There was no expectation that he was going to grow into anything or become anything significant. And it was kind of interesting because, to me, there are a lot of aspects of Spider-Man Homecoming that pull directly from the Ultimate Universe. And it's always been that way with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Marvel Cinematic Universe is rooted more in the Ultimate Universe than it is in the main Marvel continuity. There's some differences. I mean, there are some main Marvel timeline things that are folded in. For example, Captain America Steve Rogers is the first super soldier in the main Marvel universe, but he's not the first super soldier in the Ultimate Universe. And that actually brings us in to the story of Miles Morales' origin. And the reason why is because of the fact that all of this basically deals with Norman Osborn and Osborn Industries, as well as something called the Oz Formula. Now, the Oz Formula is just one of several attempts in the Ultimate Universe to basically duplicate the original super soldier serum that made Nick Fury. And this is one of the biggest differences when it came to the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel Universe. With regards to the main Marvel continuity, you have what's called Weapons Plus. And Weapons Plus is basically just this organization that serves the purpose of creating super soldiers to battle against credible threats. The idea was that Captain America Steve Rogers was Weapon 1. That was it. But because of the fact that Dr. Abraham Erskine, the guy that was behind the formula that made Steve Rogers into a super soldier, had basically been killed, it was impossible to duplicate his formula perfectly. And so the idea was to try to attempt it, but if it didn't work, to also have backup projects instead. And so what we got were projects 2 through 9. And that was everything from, like, you know, implanting cybernetic implants in like animals, trying to make animals sentient. It was a multitude of just different things that all had to do with creating super soldiers. Eventually it led into Weapon 10 or Weapon X, which gave us Wolverine, which led into like Deadpool and, you know, all different kinds of stuff. But all of it was rooted in the idea of Captain America Steve Rogers. In the Ultimate Universe, it's a wholly different kettle of beans. The way it all worked out is that instead of Steve Rogers, Nick Fury was the very first super soldier. But much like Captain America Steve Rogers in the main Marvel Universe, the entire basis behind the super soldier serum had basically gone up in smoke. Nobody really knew how to replicate it. But what ended up happening is different organizations across the world began attempting to duplicate it. Of course, in Canada, for example, they were trying to duplicate the process that made Nick Fury into a super soldier, and that resulted in them kidnapping James Howlett and discovering the X gene, which meant that if these X genes were basically unlocked or they were accessed, people would be granted powers. And so once they accessed the powers of James Howlett, then they in turn turned this formula or what have you into an aerosol form, dispersed it across the world, and that's how mutants started popping up. When it came to Norman Osborn and the Oz formula, that was based off the super soldier formula that was used to make Nick Fury into a super soldier. And so the idea was that Norman Osborn was trying to find a way to again create super soldiers, and in doing so began the process of like irradiating spiders and so on and so forth. One of these spiders bit Peter Parker, which led to the start of the Ultimate Spider-Man line of stories. Now, that deals with the idea of like mutants and most of the superpowered community. The idea was that in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, Peter Parker had just gone forward, you know, as a superhero, and he was learning about his powers. With great power must come great responsibility that he was taught by Uncle Ben. Fast forwarding over the course of his publication history, once we got into like 2011, 2012, writer Brian Michael Bendis wanted to shift things up. He wanted to basically remove Peter Parker and put somebody in his place. The fact remains here that in the instance of Peter Parker effectively getting away, the idea of Osborn was to basically figure out what it was about the formula that gave Peter Parker powers in the first place and then duplicate it. Now, of course, this all dead ends into the idea of Norman Osborn being revealed as the Green Goblin and so on and so forth. But then we actually pick up with a guy by the name of Prowler. Now, in the main Marvel line of stories, Prowler is a guy named Hobie Brown. And you may have heard of his line of comics. He got his own solo series as part of All New, All Different Amazing Spider-Man's Clone Conspiracy. Really, the biggest role that Hobie Brown plays in All New, All Different Marvel is he's the stand-in Spider-Man. When Peter Parker is, holding a press conference or when he's in the middle of a meeting or something like that, Hobie Brown is the one that parades around as Spider-Man so that people believe that Peter and Spider-Man are two distinctly different people. Here in this Ultimate Universe line of stories, he's basically just the uncle of Miles Morales. He's just a guy. And they call him Prowler because he's basically just a guy that steals stuff. But breaking into Osborn Industries has its own risks in the sense that you're basically breaking into a multinational corporation. Not only that, in the middle of this heist, the spider manages to make its way onto Prowler, which in turn enters his bag, taking this spider with him. Now, from here, we pick up with Miles Morales, and that's one of the things that I like the most about Miles, is that Miles, the way his story was told, the way it was done by Brian Michael Bendis, he was designed to basically be a character that reflected the real world. And most of the Ultimate Universe was like that. The Ultimate Universe was Marvel coming along and saying, okay, how can we take these characters that everybody knows and everybody loves and update them for the modern day so they could basically get an answer to the question, what if Captain America emerged right now? That was the whole basis behind the Ultimate Universe back when it was made in the year 2000. And so the idea is that Miles Morales is basically in a lottery for a charter school. There was a good documentary that was done a while ago called Waiting for Superman. At least either it's Waiting for Superman or Waiting on Superman. But the idea was that it dealt with like the American school system. And something that a lot of you guys may not know is that in a lot of like inner city schools and really impoverished parts of the country, you'll have like the public school system, and then they'll open a charter school, which is like where you can get the best education in that particular school district. And they'll hold lotteries. Like people will go to like these huge assembly halls and they'll basically start drawing numbers. And those kids who were selected get to go to that charter school. The others are just left to deal with the American school system. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, if they win and they get to go to a charter school, they'll have a future outside of whatever education they get from the American school system being as defunded as it is. So it's not really designed to be like a political statement. It's designed to make Miles Morales relatable. And that's one of the things that I kind of feel like needs to be said, especially right now in Marvel, because a lot of people are looking at the whole, political landscape and so on and so forth. This was written back in 2011. And so while Brian Michael Bendis does have a tendency to be a little political with his writing, this was not designed to be a statement. It was basically designed to say, here's a relatable aspect of Miles Morales, because there are kids that deal with this every day of their life in inner city areas. So again, it's kind of cool here because as a kid who is part Hispanic, part African American, it really related to a lot of young people who were reading his comics because that really feeds into the nature of Spider-Man. Keep in mind, Peter Parker's legacy was formed by the fact that he basically empowered teenagers. He made young people feel like they were the star of the show. And that legacy of Spider-Man lives on because you get a little bit of the humor, but you also get that whole backstory in terms of everything that happened that made him who he was. And so with Miles Morales winning this, we're basically introduced to the idea of his uncle. Miles does not know about the role that his uncle plays in being a thief. For him, his uncle is just an uncle. And so it's really just kind of Miles relaying the news and that kind of thing. But the funny scenario about this too is that Miles was really told in a lot of ways, do not go see your uncle. His father had explicitly laid that out. Do not go see him on the regular. He is not a good influence. Now, of course, again, the whole idea of a thief, but we'll actually learn there's a little more about Miles' dad than we were originally given. There's a little bit of an expansion here. But of course, in the middle of all this, he's basically bitten by the radioactive spider that his uncle had carried home and then suddenly just wakes up. Now, of course, with Miles' dad coming home, screaming at his brother and that kind of thing, Miles basically just takes off. Now, this is when we start to get into a lot of the aspects of Spider-Man Homecoming, just kind of going by the trailers, just looking at what we've seen, with regards to the trailers. And the whole idea here is that Spider-Man Homecoming looks as though it's just supposed to be rooted in like the modern day. It's supposed to be rooted in a lot of like current things that go on right now, again, sort of feeding into this Ultimate Universe thing. But the introduction of it all really kind of comes by way of Miles' whole experience and learning that he has powers. The other half of this is that when Brian Michael Bendis made Miles Morales, had he gone through and made Miles just a total replica of Peter Parker, it would have cheapened it. It would have taken away the impact of Miles being Spider-Man. With Miles, one of the biggest issues that he faces is a combination of just kind of growing up, as being a teenager, and also the idea of having powers. Because remember, one of the relatable aspects of this is just teenage life. And I don't know about you guys, I don't know how many of you guys watching this are teenagers, but being a teenager, I mean, it's in hindsight, it's the easiest thing in the world. But at the time when you are a teenager, it seems like the hardest thing in the world because you're trying to make friends, you're trying to be socially acceptable, you also want to be able to drive around and have your own independence, but you also recognize you're not necessarily ready for the world, but you think you are. There's a million things that go on in your head. I mean, there's college, there's your future, there's a million things rolling around in your head, to say nothing of the fact that you're basically spending, 5 or 6 years going through an existential crisis. Who are you? Where are you going? What's your purpose in the universe? I mean, these are all the things that teenagers deal with on a regular basis. And so this combined with the idea of the sudden introduction of powers makes things a little difficult. Now, the other half of this is a character by the name of Genki. And this is really the whole idea of like Ned Leeds' character being brought in to Spider-Man Homecoming. One of the funny situations and one of the things that fans immediately caught on when it came to the trailer of Spider-Man Homecoming is the character of Ned Leeds. Historically speaking, in the Peter Parker Spider-Man line of stories in the main Marvel universe, Ned Leeds was like a competitor at the Daily Bugle. He was never a classmate of Peter Parker. With this introduction of Ned Leeds in Spider-Man Homecoming, it's basically Genki from the Ultimate Universe in the sense that the two of them relate to each other in the exact same way. Genki's kind of like the comedic sidekick. He's the kid who sort of cheers Spider-Man on, cheers Miles Morales on and says, look, man, like, you're capable of incredible things. But it's also the idea that Genki's going to be the moral compass for Miles Morales in a lot of different ways. But it's kind of cool because instead of just like being terrified, instead of being afraid, it's this idea that Miles could achieve something pretty incredible with the powers that he has. And so in the middle of this whole conversation that he has, with Genki, he's basically pulled aside by his father, taken to a local park, and his father basically explains the reason why he doesn't want Miles spending time with his uncle is because of the fact that his uncle's a thief. And that's one of the greatest things about this particular story is because with Peter Parker Spider-Man in the main Marvel universe, it's, well, Uncle Ben died, and then with great power must come great responsibility, and the moral lessons that came with that. With Miles Morales, it's a lot more visceral. It's this idea that his father basically made a lot of bad decisions. His father stole at one point in time. His father served time in jail somewhere along the line. For him, he looks at his son Miles and says, you've just been accepted to a charter school. You have a future. You can get out of this place. But this also creates a bit of a contradiction with Miles himself, because in his mind, in his imagination, he sees himself being Spider-Man. He sees himself crawling on walls, which he inevitably does. He sees himself saving the day. And that's one of the interesting things about this story is because, once he goes and visits, Genki and kind of tells him everything that's going on, kind of expands on the idea that he can crawl on walls and so on and so forth. And once he actually travels, alongside Genki and comes across a fire in a building, this creates the kind of inner debate, with Miles Morales between what his father's teaching him and what he's coming to understand on his own. His father's looking at the big picture, but his father doesn't know that Miles has spider powers. So in the mind of Miles' father, it's, here's my son who lives in a pretty rough part of town, who's just been accepted to a school that will get him a future. Think of all the things that he could do. He'd become a lawyer or a doctor or a businessman or something along those lines. In the mind of Miles Morales, with the powers that he has, he can save people on the ground level. And that is the inherent difference between what it is that Miles' father's teaching him and what Miles can become. Miles' father is talking about playing a much bigger role, playing a much larger role. But when you're Spider-Man, when you are on the ground floor, when you're saving somebody from a burning building, you don't say, well, hey, we're passing some laws and it's going to make people's life better, and it does. Instead, you see their faces, you see their immediate reactions, you get thank yous, you get, wow, I can't believe you pulled that off. You get the adoration of a community that comes to respect you as you're able to do things that make their lives tangibly better. That's the coolest thing about that, is because it makes it more personal. And so the struggle that Miles faces is that where he does rescue a kid from a burning building, suddenly the gravity of the situation begins to hit him, because now he realized he just saved a human life. And what that means is people will look at him and they will say, wow, that guy's a superhero. Man, that kid's amazing. I can't believe he pulled that off. But now Miles has to come to the realization that the life of other people is in his hands. What if he hadn't acted? That little girl probably would have burned to death in that building. But with Miles Morales stepping in and saving her life, then the question becomes, well, what about the lives that he inevitably just can't save? What if there's just not enough time for him to get there? What about the person who's being mugged or being attacked that he doesn't know about? How does all that play into the equation? Peter Parker Spider-Man in the main Marvel universe deals with that by realizing that while he tries to save everybody he cannot save everyone. You can't be everywhere at once. It's one of the reasons why Superior Spider-Man was so cool, because he was everywhere at once. He had eyes all throughout the entire city. But with Miles Morales, he's coming to realize that you can't be everywhere at one time. You can't save everyone. There are some people out there that you just can't do anything with. And so what we end up doing is we basically pick up with the moment by which Peter Parker ends up dying in the Ultimate Universe. And again, this was a pretty big moment in the whole Ultimate Spider-Man story, just because you got to remember, I mean, the Ultimate Universe was basically launched with Peter Parker Spider-Man. And so for about a decade or so, if you were reading Ultimate Spider-Man, you were reading Peter Parker. And the way that he went out was actually pretty amazing. I mean, it was like this battle with Norman Osborn, and he basically fought to the point that he died. He was almost like this Superman-esque scenario where it was basically just like a battle to the death. But in the midst of all this, what it does is it basically sets the groundwork for Peter Parker to be removed from the entire Spider-Man mythos, and it allows Miles Morales to effectively take his place. Now, something to point out here is that with Miles being on the scene and directly, speaking with Gwen Stacy really just kind of in a moment of mourning, sort of spits out the name of Peter Parker. But what it does is it basically kind of lights this fire in Miles Morales, because with Miles Morales seeing everything happen, when he sees sees the death of Peter Parker, he really just kind of looks at this and says, well, now it's up to me to do something. His discussion with Genki is, look, I didn't get these powers, even if that got him by chance. I have to believe if anybody had these powers, they would put them to use. They would live up to the legacy as it was created by Spider-Man. They would live up to everything it was that he did, that Peter Parker had effectively done. And so in the mind of Miles, that's when he begins to really understand what it is that he's meant to do, the significance of the role that he plays in being Spider-Man. Because going to the funeral of Peter Parker, speaking with Aunt May, speaking with Gwen Stacy, it's basically this question that he asked: why did he become Spider-Man? What was the motivation of it? And this is the beauty of this, because Gwen Stacy, immediately, as angry as she is, goes and basically says he did everything that he did because his uncle instilled in him, with great power must come great responsibility. Those with the power to act have the responsibility to act. And that is one of the reasons why the Spider-Man mythos has always been so great, and one of the reasons why it's so important. When it comes to different superheroes over the years, they all have their own moral compasses, their own motivations for why it is they do the things they do. With Superman, it was this idea that he was taught by Jonathan and Martha Kent: if you have the power to stop crime, you should stop crime. In some form or fashion, it was always this measure of responsibility. But with the infamous phrase, with great power must come great responsibility, it made it tangible. We've all heard that, right? Like, do the right thing even if no one is watching, or something along those lines. We've all had that moral compass instilled in us. But to have Gwen Stacy say this to Miles Morales in this way, it lights a fire in Miles Morales, because he's just like, that's true. It's an honest statement. I have these abilities. And so in his mind, while he goes through and designs his own little Spider-Man suit, the idea is, I have to keep the memory of Spider-Man going. And this is actually one of the first mistakes that he makes, because what they do is they grab a Spider-Man Halloween costume and he immediately takes to the streets. Now, this is one of those things where it's just too early, bro. It's just way too early. Despite Miles Morales wanting to do the right thing, his heart's in the right place, the mistake that he makes is that everybody looks at him as trying to be like a copycat of Spider-Man. But people are still in the mourning phase. You got to keep in mind, with the idea of Spider-Man losing such a hero in such a tragic way, people aren't ready to see somebody just suddenly take up the mantle. They're not ready to see somebody just suddenly become Spider-Man. What they want is time to grieve. What they want is time to mourn. And once that time has passed, then they'll be ready for somebody to take up the mantle. And so at this point, it's just too much, too fast. And so in the middle of this whole experience that he has running around the streets dressed as Spider-Man, he's basically met with the arrival of Jessica Drew. Now, Jessica Drew is actually a pretty interesting character in the realm of Marvel Comics. And the reason why is because she originally appeared in Marvel Spotlight in 1977, I think it was. And she was actually a character who basically gained her spider powers by way of a direct injection from her father. And it was really just a weird circumstance. It was essentially that she had just been, irradiated by uranium that was, across the land and so on. And her father basically tried to cure her of her uranium poisoning by injecting her with a serum that was composed of different spiders, and then putting her in this sort of evolution chamber that was created by the high evolutionary who messed around with the evolution of animals and stuff like that. She woke up something like decades later and basically just kind of emerged with no idea who she was, and eventually joined Hydra or something like that. But with the Ultimate Universe, it's a wholly different kettle of beans. And so Jessica Drew in the Ultimate Universe is actually a clone of Peter Parker. And that's one of the interesting things, is because with her character, despite people knowing who she wasn't so significant in the realm of Marvel Comics that they kind of had to tiptoe around and be careful about what they did. She wasn't Captain America, she wasn't Thor, she wasn't like Iron Man or anything like that. And so because of that, it offered Marvel a little bit of leeway in terms of what they did with her character, how they wrote her, how they designed her, so on and so forth. Also because of the fact that the Clone Saga from Marvel Comics was not a very well-received story for a lot of people. And so the idea of going back and reworking it in the Ultimate Universe was actually kind of cool. It was actually pretty interesting. But with her confronting Miles Morales, this comes by way of the fact that she was basically told by Nick Fury, there's somebody out there impersonating Spider-Man. That happened within, a wholly separate line of stories, but the fact remains that with Nick Fury basically being the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and then essentially having all this information on the life and times of Miles, the cool thing is that there's a conversation that takes place between the two of them, where Nick Fury basically says, look, I know your heart's in the right place. I know you're trying to do the right thing, but people are not ready for a new Spider-Man yet. Give them time. Give them a little bit of time. They'll come around. But for right now, all they see you as is a cheap knockoff because you're wearing the exact same uniform that Spider-Man wore. So if you are going to be Spider-Man, if you're going to be a superhero, then you've got to be different. You can't just be Peter Parker. You've got to be your own character. And that was kind of like an in-comic book statement by Brian Michael Bendis, effectively saying Miles Morales is his own character. He's wholly different from Peter Parker. They're two distinctly different characters. And that was one of the interesting things, is because again, it was hitting home at the idea that he'd basically sort of gone away. And so what ended up happening is that, of course, with Electro, Maxwell Dillon basically being one of the most notable villains villains of the Ultimate Spider-Man making his escape, Miles Morales is single-handedly responsible for basically being able to bring him down. Now, the Ultimates are there, the Ultimate Universe Avengers are there, and they do what they can, but it's really Miles Morales that pulls it off through a combination of his ability to make himself invisible and the fact that he issues this sort of electrical touch whenever it is that he engages somebody. Now, the reason why that works is because what it does is it basically sends the electrical impulses of Electro into overdrive and really just sort of hyperdrives him and then just shuts him down. He's basically overwhelmed by his own powers. But, with him being shot dead by Nick Fury as a way to kind of curtail his character a little bit, what happens is it's basically Miles Morales showing the Ultimates that he's actually pretty legit. He's got what it takes to not only be a member of the team, but to also stand on his own 2 feet as his own superhero. Now, at this point, he's not part of the Ultimate Avengers yet. He hasn't really been rolled in as part of the ranks just because, 1, he doesn't have the experience, and 2, they just don't know enough about him. But the first step to allowing the Ultimates to gain more information about him, to see what he's about, is, really comes by way of Nick Fury, who presents Miles Morales with an actual Spider-Man costume based on Miles' own designs. When he was just kind of drawing up these little versions of his own costume, when he was trying to figure out what he was going to look like, Nick Fury basically used S.H.I.E.L.D.'s resources, found this design, I don't know, broke into his home, I have no clue, but took this costume, made it real, and gave it to Miles and said, now go forward and be your own superhero. Okay, so getting into Ultimate Spider-Man, or I guess really Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man, one thing I want to point out here is that in these video titles, I'm simply going to call these Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man, and Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, and so on. Really, the origin story that we did is Volume 1, so this is more like Volume 2. But in truth, this was really just kind of called Ultimate Spider-Man. And then there was another series later on that followed this that was called Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man. But in order to avoid confusion between Ultimate Spider-Man Peter Parker and Ultimate Spider-Man Miles Morales, we're just going to call this Ultimate Spider-Man Miles Morales, so that way everything's pretty clear and pretty easy to follow. But the cool thing about this is that, again, the origin story, for those of you guys who are just joining us with regards to the whole Ultimate Spider-Man landscape, the Ultimate Universe was never designed to be this great, big, huge, grandiose thing like the main Marvel Universe. The main Marvel Universe was really kind of built by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, a handful of other writers and artists in the 1960s and 70s, and then it grew to what it is now, where it's just massive in scope, and you have the Avengers, and you have, Excalibur, and you have Alpha Flight, and you have, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants and the X-Men and so on and so forth. The Ultimate Universe was designed to be far more contained and much, much smaller in scale. And so the result is that when it came to the Ultimate Spider-Man stories by Brian Michael Bendis, the idea was to basically keep things relatively small, to tell these small volumes where characters would appear and then never be seen or heard from again, or else if they were seen, they were just in a containment cell or they were being held by S.H.I.E.L.D. or something along those lines. But it was very easy to digest and it was very, very easy to follow. And that's one of the reasons why the Ultimate Universe was relatively popular, but in the end, people still gravitated toward the characters that they thought of when they thought of Captain America, when they thought of Thor, and so on and so forth. Now, with regards to Miles Morales, Peter Parker was basically the recipient of a bite from a spider that contained the Oz formula. And again, the whole idea here in the Ultimate Universe was that Nick Fury, I guess Samuel Jackson Nick Fury if you want to call him that, Nick Fury was the original super soldier. And when the super soldier serum that was used on Nick Fury proved to be successful, it resulted in this great gold rush, more or less, for everybody to create their own super soldiers. And so that's where Wolverine came from. Wolverine was the recipient of Canada's attempt to create a super soldier serum, but along the way, they discovered a mutant gene that when activated would give people powers. And that was the origin of the mutant race in the Ultimate Universe. When it came to Spider-Man, you had a guy, Norman Osborn, who was basically trying to create a super soldier serum. And he created something called the Oz formula, and where he was going through and testing it on different spiders. One of these spiders bit Peter Parker, which led him to become Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe. But following the course of his publication history, somewhere around 160 issues or so, which this is far shorter than that. I think Miles Morales' stories probably total in like maybe 30 or 40 issues. It's not really that long at all. But following the publication history of Peter Parker, he eventually died. And the reason was because Marvel was wanting to basically make way for a new Spider-Man. And that just made good sense. You had Ultimate Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and then you had the main Marvel Universe Peter Parker. Why have two versions of the same character? Give us a new Spider-Man. And so that's what they did. They killed off Peter Parker, and they had a spider basically bite a new kid by the name of Miles Morales, who gained Peter Parker's powers, and then a couple of his own that Peter didn't have. For example, Miles Morales can administer this venom shock, which is basically kind of like an electrical impulse that basically shocks a person that's touching him or something along those lines. He can make himself invisible, he can camouflage himself, that kind of a thing. And so again, Miles was very much his own character, but the whole idea here, and really where the story begins to pick up, is we start to get into his uncle, Aaron Davis. Now, the crazy thing about Aaron Davis's character is that as interesting as he is, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye. It's not as clean cut as him just being a con man, but that's how he comes off. He comes off as a con artist, he comes off as a thief and a cheat, but he's actually a very capable guy. And the way this story unfolds is it's actually going to be a sort of a battle of allegiances, so to speak, for Miles Morales himself. But what ends up happening here is we actually pick up with Aaron Davis traveling back, or at least intending to meet the Tinkerer. Now, the Tinkerer is basically a character who creates devices. I mean, really, the Tinkerer was who we saw in the Spider-Man Homecoming movie that was working alongside Michael Keaton. The other half of this is that it also deals with the introduction of a new version of the Scorpion. And the reason why I say new version is because of the fact that in the Peter Parker Ultimate Spider-Man line of comics, in those stories, the Scorpion was introduced, but he was actually introduced as a clone of Peter Parker. The issue with this was that with Brian Michael Bendis writing the story at the time and wanting to create a new Spider-Man, it also made sense to give this new Spider-Man, Miles Morales, his own villains to face off against. And so what ended up happening is the Scorpion, as he appeared in the original Peter Parker stories in the Ultimate Universe, he was basically defeated, he was revealed to be a clone of Peter Parker, and then he was just never really seen or heard from again after he was taken captive by S.H.I.E.L.D. That was really it. This version of Scorpion seems to be more in line with the Scorpion that we saw from Spider-Man Homecoming. This Scorpion seems to be more grounded in terms of who he is and what he's about and that kind of a thing. His backstory still remains pretty ambiguous, and it will for a little while, but suffice it to say, he's basically in New York because of the fact that Prowler owes him cash, and that's really about it. Now, the other half of this is Miles Morales trying to make his way and trying to figure out how to be a superhero. But the other thing to focus on here is that Miles is struggling with the exact same thing that Peter Parker did. And that's one of the cool things about this, is that what Bendis and them are basically saying is that no matter what universe we're in, for the most part, unless the character is drastically different from who we're used to, he's always going to struggle with the same thing. Should he tell his friends and family who he is? And if he does, what are the consequences of that? Because remember, if he were to tell his mom, for example, that he's Spider-Man, she may believe him, she may not believe him. But if she has that knowledge, it makes her a target for somebody else. And so she basically can't spill the beans on something she doesn't know anything about. And if Miles never tells her, then nobody has any reason to go after her. They have no reason to connect the two people. Now, something else to focus on is that, again, when Bendis and them created Miles Morales, they didn't just abandon the concept of Peter Parker in his entirety. I mean, he's dead, he doesn't show up, and he won't show up again until Spider-Man. But the idea here was to keep the legacy of Peter Parker going. Genki really just kind of goes to Miles and says, look, it's cool that you're Spider-Man, but you don't really know what you're doing. And Peter Parker's not here to teach you what you need to know because he's dead. And so you need to be able to learn what Peter Parker knew from Peter Parker himself the best way you know how, which is to basically watch movies of Peter Parker fighting. And that's kind of the cool thing because, Miles gets a video, gets to watch footage of the Ultimate Universe Peter Parker facing off against Dr. Octopus, nothing too significant, but his first real attempt in trying to stand toe-to-toe and trying to really become Spider-Man comes with the arrival of a character by the name of Omega Red. Now, Omega Red in the Ultimate Universe was starkly different from his character in the main Marvel Universe. In the main Marvel Universe, Omega Red was the byproduct of the Russians trying to duplicate Wolverine. That's really all it was. It was the idea that Wolverine had been taken by the Weapon X project, his healing factor had been used in order to bond his body with adamantium, and the result was that he ended up going forward as just this adamantium-laced killing machine. The Russians tried to duplicate the same process, but the difference here is that the Russians didn't know the formula for adamantium, and so because of that, they ended up creating a cheap knockoff called carbonadium. Now, carbonadium's still pretty durable, and it's still pretty potent in terms of what it's capable of, but naturally, this eventually led to a battle of sorts between Omega Red and Wolverine, with the two of them becoming mortal enemies. In the Ultimate Universe, it was starkly different. Omega Red was basically just a guy who was a mutant. He gained these powers that allowed him to just kind of expand these organic tendrils from his body. He could emit toxins, different things like that, but he wasn't nearly as capable as his main Marvel counterpart. But the reason why this is important is because of the fact that for Miles Morales, going against somebody like Omega Red is going against someone he's never experienced before. And so it's really him kind of on the edge of his seat, using his powers as best he can, trying to become a legitimate hero, because with trying to dodge these tendrils and so on, it requires him to use basically every ounce of agility he has. As we would expect, he comes out on top. But the idea of of Aaron Davis being rolled in as part of Miles Morales Spider-Man's story comes when, again, Aaron Davis basically encounters the Tinkerer. And it's the idea that the Tinkerer, you know, when Aaron Davis is looking at this newspaper about a new Spider-Man and so on and so forth, the Tinkerer basically gives Aaron Davis the whole backstory of how Spider-Man became Spider-Man. The original Peter Parker became Spider-Man. Of course, as we talked about, Norman Osborn created the Oz formula, so on and so forth. But this also rings a bell for the Prowler, because remember, in our video on the origin of Miles Morales, he was bitten by a spider in front of Uncle Aaron Davis. And the result was that Aaron Davis saw the spider and saw a number on it. And so because of that, when, you know, Tinkerer begins to explain all these things about what Osborn was doing, how he would perform experiments on these spiders, he would number them and he would catalog them in order to keep track of what his experiments were doing and how they were progressing, Aaron Davis comes to the realization that a numbered spider bit his nephew, and then suddenly there's this new Spider-Man on the scene. Two and two together, Miles Morales is Spider-Man. And that's why I say that Prowler, Aaron Davis, is actually sharper than people give him credit for. I mean, he's smarter than your average bear, I guess. But it's kind of a cool thing because it sets the stage for this idea of Aaron Davis being brought in, asking for some pretty nefarious things. And that's really the first thing that he does. I mean, as soon as he realizes that Miles is Spider-Man, he goes to him and says, hey man, like, we should work together. Like, we can put our efforts together and we can really achieve something great. Now, remember, Miles was informed by his father that his uncle Aaron was a con artist and a crook and served time in jail. Miles' father was heading down the same path. And so Miles' father had basically warned him, hey, look, do not get in the mix with your uncle Aaron. The other half of this is that Miles' father, I wouldn't go as far as to say is a very cautious man, so much as he's trying to ensure his son stays safe, but he's also a little overprotective. And this is where the whole element of loyalties begins to come into play. Because with Miles Morales, he's kind of stuck in two different situations. The first is that he believes in his father. I mean, it's his dad. You know, he follows his father as best he can, but it almost feels like his father's trying to shelter him from the world's experiences. And life in and of itself, people growing and becoming something better than they are, is all about experiences, doing something stupid and learning from that experience. At the same time, it's his uncle Aaron Davis, and he knows that he's a crook, but if he wants to go out and experience life, there's a lot of different ways to do that, but family is family, blood is blood. And so again, that's one of the interesting things about this story, and that's one of the reasons why I've loved Miles Morales' character for so long, is because it's just the inner struggle between the two of them. Now, with regards to Aaron Davis having killed the Tinkerer so that nobody would know about the possibility of Miles Morales being Ultimate Spider-Man, it also comes into play with him, I guess, re-encountering Scorpion again. And this is when we basically learn that Scorpion was owed money by Aaron Davis, that presumably Aaron Davis essentially cheated him out of cash. Scorpion comes back looking for his money. Now, the other half of this is that we also get some perspective in terms of what Scorpion's capable of. And what we're actually informed here is that he's not just some crazy guy, you know, who is a mob boss out of Mexico. Instead, he does have some abilities. And one of the most notable is a highly resistant skin. Aaron Davis ultimately just ends up fleeing for his life when he begins to realize just how capable Scorpion is, and that he's not really a pushover. Now, of course, this leads to exactly what we would expect it to, in the sense that Aaron Davis essentially flees to his nephew, Miles Morales. And this is probably one of the best elements of the story. And the reason for this is because Aaron Davis approaching his nephew is done from ill intent. Like, it's him showing up and essentially having this ulterior motive. There's a guy trying to kill me, I want to try to take him out, so on and so forth. But he doesn't say that. He doesn't go to Miles Morales and say, hey man, I did something really bad. I screwed a guy over in Mexico and he got here to New York and he's trying to kill me. You got to help me take this guy out. That's not what he says. Instead, what he does is he pawns it off on the idea of being a tutor of sorts. And that's kind of the cool thing, because Aaron Davis uses, you know, basically the abilities of his suit combined with his own experiences to engage Miles in hand-to-hand combat. And this is why I say, sometimes, despite the fact that there can be nefarious purposes here, at the end of the day, there is still something to be learned. And so while Aaron Davis is trying to manipulate his own nephew, Aaron Davis is teaching Miles how to become a more effective fighter. Because remember, Miles doesn't have any martial arts training. He doesn't have military training. He has no kind of training at all. He's a kid who was bitten by a radioactive spider and then suddenly has all these powers. And so he doesn't know how to fight. He doesn't have any of that kind of training stuff. He's really just flying by the seat of his pants every step of the way in every single conflict he gets into. Now, the other half is to remember, he learns as he goes through. And that's kind of the cool thing, is because he's literally learning to fight while he's fighting. And so that's one of the crazy things about his character and his evolution. But the idea of Aaron Davis is saying, look, I'm trying to help you out here. Now, Aaron is not totally evil. Like, he's not a total bad guy. He's not just like, I don't care care whether you live or die. I'm just trying to make sure that this guy, Scorpion, gets off my back. Instead, it's really this idea that he's going to him and he's saying, look, I don't want to see you killed. And that really is one of the reasons why Aaron Davis's character is so intricate and is so complex, is because on one half, he's a thief, he's a con artist, he's a manipulator, but at the other half, that's family. That's his nephew. The last Spider-Man was killed by his own enemies. It'd be a lot easier for Miles Morales to be killed by different foes because he doesn't have nearly the experience or the training that Peter Parker had. And so again, it's kind of a cool scenario. Now, of course, ultimately Miles is able to overcome Aaron Davis to the point that he proves that he's able to hold his own to a degree. And this is where the conversation begins to unfold, is because Aaron Davis basically says, I want to train you. I want to make you a good fighter. I want to turn you into somebody who can be a legitimate superhero. And this is why it's kind of this idea that these two characters have conflicting sides where, you know, Aaron Davis is just kind of a small-time crook and a con man, and Miles Morales is trying to be a good guy. At the end of the day, they have a common goal, and the common goal is to take out an even worse bad guy named Scorpion. And so that's the common ground that the two of them reside on at this moment. It allows the characters to sort of progress and to grow and so on and so forth. And so where we ultimately have Miles just kind of cruising the internet and trying to learn about this Scorpion character, and we eventually have him just sort of mulling this entire situation over, and then ultimately agreeing to side with his uncle Aaron against the wishes of his parents after learning that this guy Scorpion has engaged in acts of racketeering, murder, theft, violating other human beings. This guy is just a genuinely terrible human being. And so because of that, you know, ultimately Miles ends up siding with his uncle, which again sets the stage for some pretty cool stuff. But okay, so we are a couple weeks out from the release of the PlayStation 5 and Miles Morales Spider-Man. Spider-Man Miles Morales, I guess is what they're calling it, whatever it is, the Spider-Man 2 game. And here's the thing, okay, I'm actually kind of sad about this. Myself and Mariah have not pre-ordered, like we didn't get a chance to pre-order the PS5, right? Like the pre-orders were out like that, like it was insane. So here's the deal. Are there any members of the Rob Corps in Columbus, Ohio that can hook up myself and Mariah with PlayStation 5s? Right, I'll give you like an extra $200 plus the cost of the PlayStation 5s if you can hook us up. That would be awesome, right? That'd be super cool. If you can, send me an email, rob@comicsexplained.com. That would be amazing. I don't know if any of you guys can. We'll even go as far as Cleveland if we have to, but that'd be awesome if you guys could, right? So it's been a little while since we covered Miles Morales, right? We covered the first two, and I think we did it like 3 years ago. So we're gonna do a little bit of catch up here for people who are really uncertain and who are kind of lagging behind in the midst of all this. So Miles Morales becoming Spider-Man came out of what was basically like Cataclysm to a degree, right? It was basically this great big huge story arc in the Ultimate Universe where that version of Spider-Man had died, right? So a little bit of explanation here. The Ultimate Universe was launched in 2000, and it was the answer to the question, what would it look like if superheroes existed in the real world, right? A more modern depiction of superheroes as we know them in Marvel Comics. The Ultimate Universe was hugely popular, and it was basically launched with Ultimate Spider-Man, right? With Peter Parker. Now, when Peter Parker died, Spider-Man fans were pissed, right? They were so mad because they loved that version of Spider-Man. And as we know, as comic book fans, we don't really like it when things change, right? We like things to stay the same forever and ever and ever, because when things are different, it takes us getting used to it again, and we just don't want to have to go through all that. You know, we're old people, right? We just get stuck in our ways. And the result of this is that when Miles Morales initially came onto the scene, there was a lot of hate for the character of Miles. The funny thing is, he's hugely popular now. So much so that, like, one, he's got his own game, and two, I've heard nothing but people being excited about the new Miles Morales game, right? So as with most things in comics, give it time and you may end up finding that you like it. But the whole thing behind this is that in the early days and kind of in the beginning of this, Miles Morales, having been bitten by a spider that gave him radioactive powers in much the same way that Peter Parker did, was met with a lot of backlash in the Ultimate Comics universe, right? Like in the actual comics themselves, because Peter Parker had like just died. And then Miles, you know, in order to honor the memory of Peter, went out and got a Spider-Man suit and then was like, okay, let's be Spider-Man, right? And he was met by like Nick Fury, he was met by Jessica Drew or whatever you want to call her, basically the Ultimate Universe version of Spider-Girl, Spider-Woman. And they were kind of like, you can't do this, right? Like you're disrespecting the memory of Peter. But the reality was that Miles believed that he was honoring the memory of Peter, right? Like he believed he was doing the right thing. And so ultimately he ended up getting the blessing of Nick Fury. And then this led to the introduction of the Prowler, right? And the Prowler was a character who had already been around. And the Prowler was basically the uncle of Miles Morales. He was basically Aaron, right? And the idea behind this was that you ended up having Miles basically allying himself with Aaron as part of Aaron's request. Now, when Miles started realizing that things were a little sketchy here, that's when all this kind of started popping off, right? But this really is kind of like when the two of them first start teaming up. We as the reader knew that Aaron was a bad guy, right? Like we knew he was basically a villain. He was one of the most wanted men in the United States. And in fact, he was wanted by Interpol and the FBI, right? Like it was a huge deal. Again, it's probably one of the best thieves, if not the best thief in the entirety of the Ultimate Universe. He was kind of a big deal. Now, with him and Miles teaming up for the first time, this involves them going after a guy by the name of Scorpion. In Marvel, in the Ultimate Universe, you had two versions of the Scorpion character, and you're probably familiar with him from like maybe Spider-Man, the animated series back in the 90s, or comic books, or whatever the case is. But the Scorpion that you initially saw in Ultimate Comics was part of the Ultimate Universe line of the Clone Saga, right? Like cloning Peter Parker. That's where, the Jessica character came from and so on. But the Scorpion was a clone of Peter Parker, right? So that was kind of like that version that we saw. I wouldn't go as far as to say he was hugely popular. I honestly didn't really enjoy the whole concept. But the thing about this is that this version of Scorpion that we see here is the guy who's actually named Maximus Gargan, right? So his name is almost identical to the one from the main Marvel Universe, Max Gargan. The difference here is that unlike Mac Gargan in the main Marvel Universe, who's just a guy who's a criminal, in the Ultimate Universe, Maximus Gargan was basically a Mexican crime lord, is essentially what he was. He was like a Mexican drug kingpin, but he was working for Prowler. And so essentially you had this kind of exchange that was supposed to go on between the two of them. But basically Maximus Gargan ended up turning on the Prowler. It led into a great big huge fight. Prowler basically got out of there. And then Maximus has come here to New York City in order to make himself a kingpin. And because of the fact that he was able to overcome Prowler before, the indication is he can do it again, right? So he's not too worried about the Prowler's character. But that's why they're here, is because Aaron is trying to get rid of Maximus, or trying to get rid of Scorpion, because Scorpion's encroaching on his turf. The idea that he's pitching to Miles Morales is he's a bad guy, right? So we got to get rid of bad guys. So he's essentially using Miles' desire to be a hero in order to effectively turn Miles into his own enforcer, is really kind of what's happening here. But Scorpion showing up here and just being like, okay, so like, this is my spot now, right? Like I'm taking over this. Like I was a guy who operated in Mexico, that's true, but like now I want to swim with the bigger fish, right? And so I'm taking the entirety of New York over. I'm going to become its new kingpin. The funny thing about this is that he's immediately met by Aaron, right? He's immediately met by the Prowler, and in turn the Prowler's like, okay, so like you gotta go. Right? You gotta go. Now the response of Scorpion is like, you still owe me payment, right? Like you still owe me for our last deal that went down. Technically that's true. That when that deal initially went down, that Aaron was the one who refused to live up to his end of the bargain. Now he did so under the auspices that Scorpion tried to double cross him, right? And saying like, you forfeited your share of this whole thing when you tried to double cross me, but technically a deal is a deal. And so the result of this is that, Scorpion's here to kind of call in his end and take out the Prowler if he can, and then take over New York himself. Now, of course, this leads to Spider-Man jumping in. Now, there are questions that you're most likely asking here, right? Where are characters like Daredevil or like Luke Cage or Heroes for Hire or any of the number of ground level heroes that we see in New York that could easily respond to a threat like this? The reality of the Ultimate Universe, guys, is that it was designed to be a far more stripped down version of the main Marvel Universe. The main Marvel Universe, just to give you perspective, had like thousands of mutants who had appeared over the course of Marvel's publication history, and those are the ones that they focused on for any real measure of time. When you take into account the one-offs, the ones who appeared for like a single story, then you're starting to get into the hundreds of thousands, right? There were just, so many different mutants that had appeared. And so you take that and you expand it to like the almost never-ending roster of Avengers. You add in things like the Midnight Suns, right? You add in like, Doctor Strange's Black Ops Defenders team from like the 1990s, right? They carried out like all these secret missions and things like that. It was super cool. It was an awesome concept. It was terribly executed, but it was an awesome concept. But you take all these things and you're throwing it in, and what you end up in the main Marvel Universe, you end up with this just hugely expansive landscape of heroes, and it's insanely difficult to keep up with it all. The Ultimate Universe wanted to correct that, right? So you have like the Ultimates, you've got the Fantastic Four, you've got the X-Men, you got Spider-Man, and that's basically it, right? You see other characters kind of pop in and out, but you weren't really seeing like Ultimate Comics Blade, right? You weren't really seeing that. You weren't really seeing like Ultimate Comics Werewolf by Night. You weren't really seeing any of that stuff, right? Any of like these characters that would have been interesting to see. Instead, it was designed to be super closed down. I would say that overall, in terms of individual publications, right? Individual comic book lines, I think you maybe capped out at 20 comics over the course of the Ultimate Universe's lifespan. And I'd say that's probably about it, if that, right? It was very, 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 very small. Seeing other characters would happen in other characters' comics, things like that, right? So just one of the, kind of an answer to that question, why don't we see a lot more going on here? Because it's not designed to be overly huge, right? It's one of the great things about the Ultimate Universe. But of course, this is when things pop off. Basically, you know, everybody pulls guns blazing, shots firing, everything's going all to pieces. Now, this is when we kind of get reminded a little bit of the Scorpion's powers, right? And make sure you guys check down in the description, just kind of a reminder, make sure you check down in the description. You'll find Ultimate Spider-Man, really the first 2 videos that we did, volumes 1 and 2. You'll find that down there so you can get caught up and you won't feel like you're just kind of flying in out of nowhere. But the idea behind Scorpion is that he has enhanced durability and enhanced strength. Now, he's not completely invulnerable, and he doesn't have like superhuman strength, right? Where he's like equal to the Incredible Hulk in strength or anything like that. He's just kind of got enhanced abilities, but they're enough to where he can easily hold his own against, like, you know, being shot at or being stabbed or something along those lines, right? So he doesn't really have Luke Cage's skin, but something reasonably close to it. The other part of this is that given his enhanced abilities, he also is able to go toe-to-toe with Miles Morales. But the reason why this happens is because Miles is still learning about his powers, right? He's still learning what he's capable of. Now, a lot of Miles' ability to expand beyond his existing horizons will actually come in the first Spider-Man story, which we will cover. That's basically, it was really cool. It was when Bendis basically told all the Miles Morales haters to shut up when they were like, he can't, he's not really Spider-Man. Bendis literally wrote a story where Peter Parker from the main Marvel universe and Miles Morales from the Ultimate universe, and Peter Parker's like, who cares what the world says? I think you're a great Spider-Man, go forward, right? And it's basically Bendis saying, hey, I know you guys, some of you guys out there don't like Miles Morales, tough luck. And then just like continuing to write the story. It was amazing. It was a hilarious response to the haters. But the funny thing about this is that Miles is learning his powers. And so when it comes to somebody like Peter, right, if we look at like even the Ultimate Universe comics version of Spider-Man Peter Parker, or you look at the main Marvel Universe version of Spider-Man Peter Parker, the important thing is that in the early days, he had his learning, he had his process where he learned his powers, but as time went on, it started to become second nature, to where he could just react and instinctively know what he needs to do. You know, that's one of the things that kind of came out of Dan Slott's run, is when he was talking about why Spider-Man would crack jokes all the time. Because where you kind of looked at it and saw Spider-Man as almost kind of a nonsensical character, you know, when he was engaging in fights and didn't really seem to be taking it seriously, the reason why he would crack jokes is because he wanted to make the villains think he wasn't taking them seriously, and that in turn would piss them off. And the angrier they got, the less focused they became, and the easier it would be for Peter Parker to take them out. That's one of the things that he kind of learned over the course of his time as Spider-Man. With Miles Morales, it'll be much the same way. That as we cover these comics, you'll quite literally see Miles become better at being Spider-Man. But in these early comics here, in this 3rd volume of his original run, he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't really have any official training. And that's really what he was told by Nick Fury. When Nick Fury sanctioned him as being Spider-Man, he's like, you're on your own to figure out how to be a superhero. We're not going to train you, right? We're not going to give you like official training, at least not at the moment. We're not going to do any of that, right? Like, you just got to become the best version of Spider-Man that you can on your own. And if you really are meant to be a great Spider-Man, then you will become one. If not, then you'll probably suck and you'll probably end up getting killed. Best of luck. And that was basically it. It was kind of a dick move. But, you know, ultimately, one of the things that Miles ends up doing is underestimating Scorpion, right? In the sense that he's able to overcome him for a minute. And where Aaron wants to get his revenge on Scorpion, the response of Miles is, no, it's one thing to stop a criminal. It's another to go out of your way and try to kill the guy, right? Like, that's not going to do anybody any good. And ultimately, Miles ends up intending to kind of walk away. Now, Scorpion wakes up, Scorpion attacks Miles, Miles goes invisible, he attacks Scorpion again, and then when Miles turns his back, Scorpion gets away. And so it's one of these things where he's constantly underestimating the villains that he faces off against. But that's because he simply hasn't learned that you have to make sure that they're knocked out, right? Like, you know, that's one of the things that Peter kind of learned, right, as time went on, that like as he would face off against different villains, he would realize just because they look like they're knocked out doesn't mean they are, right? You gotta pummel them a few extra times, right? You gotta, you know, smack them around a little bit more than you normally would, and then, you know, then they'll be knocked out, and that'll basically be it. You know, you gotta slap them around a bit is kind of what Peter Parker would do. But of course, this leads to of course, you know, Miles Morales tracking down Scorpion, going to attack him again, and then using his Venom Blast, right, to essentially incapacitate him. This kind of Venom Shock ability that he has to incapacitate Scorpion, and then handing Scorpion over to the cops. Now, the response to the police officers is to initially try to arrest Miles Morales, and that is the way his comics were in the early days, right? And it wasn't really like a racial thing. It wasn't like he's wearing a black Spider-Man costume, obviously he's black, get him. It wasn't necessarily like that. It was this idea that they didn't know him. Like when Peter Parker first showed up on the scene, in a lot of ways it was kind of a welcoming thing. Now, a lot of that was because of the fact that it was Spider-Man, right? And nobody wants to really read comics where the world hates Spider-Man. And then two, because it was kind of the launch of the Ultimate Universe, right? So it was designed to be kind of a celebratory run, you know, this kind of celebratory mandatory inaugural run in Peter. Now, he did run into a whole bunch of problems, and there were times when society was kind of like, but nonetheless, with Miles Morales, in a lot of ways, the writing, how the cops are depicted here is designed to kind of depict the naysayers, right? In the sense that he's not Spider-Man, we don't really know what's going on here, but get rid of him. He's not legit. And so as a result of that, of course, he makes himself invisible and ends up taking off, right? Ends up, kind of going back to where Aaron and them were, looking to find Aaron, and Aaron basically disappeared. Now, the next day, you end up getting Miles meeting up with Genki, right? Meeting up with Genki Lee. The two of them kind of talking, and he's like, dude, you busted like Maximus, right? You busted the Scorpion, like he's this huge thing. And then that's when he starts talking to his Uncle Aaron, and his Uncle Aaron's like, he's like, where'd you go? He's like, I'm gonna go get some rest. Are you okay? And it's like, okay, like we're just getting started, right? Like we're gonna get back to this again. And Miles' initial idea is, no, like I don't want to be involved in this, right? And that's when Aaron kind of breaks out that blackmail card in the sense of like, I wanted, like, then maybe I should hit up your dad, right? Maybe I should tell your dad what's going on. Now, that's a little bit of backstory that we haven't really explained yet. The idea was that Aaron, of course, has kind of always been a criminal his whole life. It started out with him just kind of getting into mischief when he was younger, and then graduating into, more intense and more, not really violent, but more serious crimes. The father of Miles was involved in that to a degree, but eventually went his own separate way, right? He kind of went, basically went on the right path, kind of corrected himself and got himself into a better place. The result of this is that the father of Miles does not like Aaron, and he does not want Aaron to have any involvement in Miles' life, and he's made that clear to Miles, right? Like, do not spend time with your uncle. He's a bad guy, right? Like, he's a criminal. Like, if you follow him, like, he will get you into trouble. He doesn't care about anybody. He doesn't care about anything. If he leads you to believe that he cares about you, it's because he's duping you, right? Like, he's using you for his own ends. And so that's one of the things that kind of went on here, is that Miles knew he wasn't really supposed to be spending time with Aaron, but he has been anyway. The other part of this is that Miles' parents don't know anything about his powers, right? They don't know that he's Spider-Man. And so he's kind of trying to keep this secret from them. Now, it's one of these things where Aaron knows this and then uses it against him and says, well, I mean, we can go in there right now, right? When Miles meets him later on, he's like, we can go in there right now and I can just tell them everything that's going on. Miles' response is, no, fine, like I'll meet with you the same place as last time. And so when the two of them end up meeting up together, Miles shows up and says, this is not gonna happen. You're like, I'll tell my parents if I need to, but here's what's gonna go on. You're gonna leave town, right? Like, you are really a bad person. You're every bit as bad as my dad said you were, right? Like, you really don't care about anybody but yourself. Like, you don't come near me, you don't come near my parents, right? Now, this was important for Miles. This was a hugely important moment for Miles Morales. And the reason why is because for his character, the way he was originally written, he wasn't necessarily a people pleaser, but he had this desire to connect with his Uncle Aaron. And the fact that he was able to connect to a degree, even when he was younger and he spent time with him, knowing that he wasn't necessarily supposed to, in this moment right now, spending time with his Uncle Aaron and trying to get to know him on a more personal level is compounded and made difficult by the fact that Aaron really is a bad guy. And so coming to him with Miles Morales being largely a character who lacked a lot of confidence in himself, right? Who lacked confidence in himself, what he was capable of and what he could achieve, to in turn come along and to go against somebody like the Prowler, who, despite not having the powers of Spider-Man, is wildly capable of going toe to toe with one. He's basically saying, like, you're gonna leave here, right? Like, you're gonna leave this town. You're never gonna talk to me or my parents again, and it's one of these things where Prowler's like, fine, like, if you want to play with the big boys, then you got to be ready. And then he in turn attacks Miles Morales. And this is not easy fight for Miles, right? Using a combination of all of his gadgetry, his sonics, all those things at his disposal, he's able to kind of get the upper hand on Miles. But one of the important things here is that Miles starts to gain more confidence in his abilities and begins to use his powers in the way that he's supposed to, right? Making himself invisible, using sneak attack, using subtlety, different things like that. And that's one of the important things to understand, is that when it comes to someone like Miles, what he lacks in experience, he makes up for in powers that Peter Parker simply just didn't have. Peter Parker did not have a Venom Blast. He could not make himself invisible, right? And so, with Miles, the fact that he's still learning how to fight, this actually bends itself to his favor, right? Instead of being something that can just enhance his existing abilities, it can help him compensate for his lack of experience, right? Making himself invisible and then coming back around again. And so he's able to kind of get the upper hand on Aaron and actually ends up damaging one of his gloves, right? One of his power gloves. And when that happens, of course, the fight ends up leading down into the street, where basically there's almost like this massive wreck or this city bus, kind of topples over when Aaron ends up blasting it, right, with his gloves. And that's really when Miles begins to get the bigger picture that Aaron really doesn't care about anybody but himself, that he really is a tried and true villain. And this is also significant because one of the biggest issues that Miles had is he had this desire to inherently see the good in everybody. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, that kind of naivety longevity can really cause you problems later on down the line, right? The belief that people are inherently good, and if they end up doing bad things, it's because they were in a rough spot, but they want to become good people. That can cost lives. And that's what Miles is learning here, that Aaron isn't a guy who was just down on his luck and ended up in a bad spot, and there's a way to reach him and turn him back into a good guy. He's just a bad person. And the fact that he's willing to like endanger the lives of a busload of people in order to get the upper hand in a fight against Miles Morales really shows the kind of person that he is. And so at that point, Miles Morales starts cutting loose, right? He starts letting loose, and it's just like, fine. Like if that's how we're gonna fight, then let's fight. This is gonna be a knockdown, drag out fight. He uses his Venom Blast, starts literally hitting Aaron from every direction and getting the upper hand. The problem with this is that in a split second, Aaron gets the upper hand on Miles and goes to attack him and seemingly does it with the intention of killing him. The problem with this is the previous attack by Miles that damaged his glove ends up coming home to roost when the whole thing explodes, right? It's like a bomb going off. And when that happens, it kills Aaron, right? It looks like it kills Aaron. And so it's just kind of like the last little word that Miles gets here from Aaron is like, look at that, right? You're just like me. You don't care who you kill as long as you come out on top. It's just this crushing response to Miles effectively getting his uncle killed, or seemingly getting his uncle killed. Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up, and make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are covering Spider-Man, but here's something that I want to throw out there real quick, right? Because I know some people are going to ask the question, Rob, didn't you cover this already? What I covered was Spider-Man 2. Here's the important thing about this, right? Spider-Man is probably one of the most important Spider-Man stories, I'd say, of the last 15 years. And the reason why is because this is the story where Peter Parker first met Miles Morales, right? So, one of the things that we've talked about here over the course of really some of the Miles Morales videos that we've done, and a lot of the Peter Parker videos that we did, is we kind of talked about the nature of the Ultimate Universe, right? So if you guys are familiar with this, we just finished a video yesterday where we talked about that in the Miles Morales one, right? So just kind of bear with me, right? We'll probably have some new people to the channel. I know you guys kind of like to get directly into it, but bear with me for a second while I kind of reiterate this. For the people who are new here, right? Who are new to Marvel Comics, in Marvel, you have a great big huge multiverse, right? Technically, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is considered part of the multiverse that makes up all of Marvel Comics. We know that for a couple different reasons. One, because it actually has a numerical designation among the Marvel multiverse, and two, because there's comics based on it, right? So that kind of brings it closer in line with being part of the Marvel multiverse. But where you had Marvel Comics as it was originally launched in the 1960s, right, with the Fantastic Four #1 and so on and so forth, that's referred to as Earth 616, right? Also known as the main Marvel universe. What we got in the year 2000 was the creation of the Ultimate Universe. And this was an answer to the question, what would it look like if at that point in time in the year 2000, superheroes had just basically popped up, right? They just kind of emerged for the very first time. What would those superheroes look like? How would they function? How would all that stuff work? And that's basically where you got Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe. Now, Ultimate Spider-Man was exceedingly popular, right? It was hugely popular because in a lot of ways, it was kind of an indirect reboot, right? Marvel didn't really reboot everything with the main Marvel Universe Spider-Man. They just gave us a new one, and people loved it, right? People absolutely loved it. But what you saw was a story where basically Peter Parker died, right? Peter Parker Spider-Man was killed, and it might behoove us to go back and cover that event, right? Cover Cataclysm and the death of Peter Parker, right? It might behoove us to do that just because, you know, we're kind of doing a lot of this stuff because the new Spider-Man game's coming out for the PlayStation. But the idea is that when that version of Peter Parker died, we ended up getting Miles Morales in his place. And when Miles Morales first showed up, there was a lot of naysayers. There were a lot of people who were just kind of like, Miles Morales sucks. He's not really Spider-Man. He's not really Peter Parker, that kind of a thing, because it kind of came from a couple different places. A lot of fans were latched on to the idea of Peter Parker even when they were reading him before the Ultimate Universe was launched, right? So all they really got was just another alternate reality version of Peter, and they loved it. A lot of people grew attached to Peter Parker Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe when that was their first place to start in Marvel Comics. But by whatever manner and whatever means, a lot of people just didn't want to see things change. This story is, in a lot of ways, kind of Brian Michael Bendis snubbing people who were naysayers of Miles Morales, right? People who were just like, this character's not going to last or anything like that. It was kind of Bendis just being like, no, he will. Like, he's going to be around for a long time. And that's really where this comes from. And I tell you that because it's important that you understand the historical context of this story as we get into it, so you can understand why this story is considered to be so important. With all that out of the way, let us jump to the main story itself. And so what we end up getting here is picking up in the main Marvel universe, Earth 616, with Peter Parker Spider-Man. And it's Peter Parker just kind of doing the stuff that Peter Parker does, right? Like swinging around, coming across some criminals, some guys who are doing some things they're not supposed to do. But here's the funny thing about this. Because of the fact that this story was written as a way to kind of tie into or kind of bring together the Ultimate Universe and the main Marvel universe, this story was written in such a way to where it was designed to treat people as if they're aware of who Spider-Man is, but they don't really know much about him, right? They don't really know a whole lot about the character, right? So it's kind of reiterating the nature of Peter Parker. And that's one of the things that you see in Marvel Comics. There are certain characters out there who people know who they are, right? People know who Iron Man is now. People know who Spider-Man is. People know who Wolverine is. But knowing who the character is and understanding the history and the context of the character are two distinctly different things. You know, so a lot of people know who Iron Man is, but I doubt they really know anything about the Mandarin, or I doubt they know about stories like Demon in a Bottle and why it's so important. What is it? The Five Nightmares run by Matt Fraction, different things like that, right? Arno Stark, Kieran Gillen's run. A lot of people probably aren't really familiar with that. So the idea is that we're just kind of giving Peter Parker in terms of how Peter Parker operates, which is to say, kind of musing to himself about how much he loves New York City and the fact that New York City is kind of like a thinking, breathing entity, right? That there are so many facets to this city. You've got people who have their nose to the ground and they're just grinding day in and day out, just trying to make it by. You've got people who are just super high up in their ivory towers, you know, the Tony Starks, the Reed Richards, who don't really have to worry about small time things, right? But you kind of have everybody who falls in between. And there's just so many different varying types of people in the city of New York that it's just so unique in that way. What it also has are criminals. There's criminals in New York City, and Spider-Man goes to visit some, and he basically wallops them one or two times, shows them what for, and then of course, you know, ends up pulling over the vehicle, you know, which was their getaway car. And as soon as he's there, he's met by the arrival of the cops, right? And the cops are just like, take off your mask, show us your face, you know, that kind of a thing. Now, the truth about this is I was never really part and parcel to this kind of depiction of Spider-Man, of Peter Parker. And the reason why is because you have had stories over the years where J. Jonah Jameson and the Daily Bugle have kind of managed to sort of turn, you know, the idea of Spider-Man into something where he can't really be trusted, he's a menace. But the long and short of it is that over the years, Spider-Man was largely trusted by society, right? You know, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He was the good guy, right? He was largely trusted in that way. There have been times where it's waxed and waned, but in this instance, I kind of feel like it should have been one of those things where it's like, thanks, Spider-Man, you know, and then that's kind of it, right? Now, the fact that the cops show up here and he's behind the wheel of a getaway car might give him a little reason to be sus, right? But I don't know why I say that all the time. Mariah started saying sus and now I say it all the time, right? Like sus. It's a weird word. But anyway, once he takes off and he kind of, you know, goes and does his thing, he ends up finding this building, you know, this kind of this office building basically, where the roof has been shattered, right? The glass has been shattered, and he's kind of like, that's a little weird. Now, of course, he ends up being drawn to that location because of a giant bright light, almost kind of an explosion of sorts. And of course, once he gets there, like the whole place kind of seems to be tarnished, right? And there's just this white light, or this bright light emanating from it all. Now, as he gets in there and as he starts investigating, his initial thought is this energy source is a little weird. Now, this story was released about a year after Spider-Man Big Time. And for those of you guys who aren't really familiar, if you ever wanted to get into Spider-Man, I always suggest people start with Big Time. We have that whole series covered on my channel. And Big Time was the start of Dan Slott's run. You had Spider-Man and you had Mary Jane, who were like married and all that kind of stuff. And then you got One More Day, then you got Brand New Day, where Marvel basically nullified it all. Because that was just so poorly received, Big Time was kind of Marvel's huge shift with Peter Parker, right? Focusing on like an all new age for Peter Parker Spider-Man. But that's kind of the good place to start, right? Because Dan Slott's run begins with that and runs all the way up through Secret Wars and after Secret Wars into Clone Conspiracy, right? So it's like a 10, almost 15-year long run of Spider-Man. It's very, very lengthy, but I think it's also incredibly good. I think it's an amazing run on Spider-Man. But the whole idea behind this is that that this takes place about a year after that. Now, the reason why I mention that is because I'm not entirely partial to how this is handled by Bendis, right? Bendis is notorious for writing a character and then pretending like nothing anybody did ever happened, right? And it's just like the only things that matter with this character is what I'm doing here, and ignoring continuity in its entirety. Now, whether it's kind of Bendis is always that way, I'm not 100% sure. I wasn't really reading Bendis back when he was part of event publications with Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada. I wasn't really reading him back then. I only really got familiar with Brian Michael Bendis once he actually came into main Marvel itself and was writing like New Avengers, right? And New Avengers was a wholly new thing, so he could kind of get away with that. It's something that I think maybe a result of his huge amount of popularity, and it's kind of like, I'm Bendis, I can do whatever whatever in the heck I want. I don't know if that's really the case or not, but the reason why that matters is because during Spider-Man Big Time, Peter Parker's intelligence had always kind of been downplayed by Marvel Comics, right? They never really kind of elevated Peter Parker to being on par with like Reed Richards or Tony Stark. You always kind of knew he was, but they never really did any of that for him. Instead, what you end up getting here is Peter Parker kind of looking at this and just being like, man, this is weird. He's like, it's not, you know, anything alien in nature. Maybe I should get a hold of like Tony Stark or Reed Richards or something like that. During Big Time, one of the big things that Dan Slott did was focus on the intelligence of Peter Parker, and in being like, Peter Parker's actually pretty daggone smart, and he doesn't always need Reed Richards or Tony Stark to solve a problem on his own. That was kind of solidified in a story where there was like a bomb that was going to go off, and nobody else could defuse it, and Peter Parker was the one who did, right? So it was kind of elevating his intelligence up and basically telling the reader base, hey, Peter Parker's not as dumb as he's being made out to be. You know, he's not just a Spider-Man, right? He's a super intelligent guy. Let's start treating him that way. So I'm not entirely partial on how this works, but as he starts navigating this room, he starts to realize all this stuff belongs to Mysterio, right? All these things belong to him. And that's when Mysterio tries to sneak up behind Peter and attack him. And of course, Peter Parker's spider sense goes off, and he basically ends up, you know, kind of being aware that he's about to be attacked and manages to dodge out of the way. Now with Mysterio, and one thing that a lot of you guys are probably aware of after having seen Spider-Man Far From Home, Mysterio is a legitimate, credible threat to Peter Parker, right? He's probably one of Peter Parker's most dangerous villains. His ability to cast illusions to basically trick Peter Parker and his spider sense, it can be pretty difficult to overcome Mysterio. And that's one of the reasons why you have, you know, Peter Parker kind of saying here, like, I've got to get this guy down as fast as I can because this guy is a real and serious threat. The other part of this is that Mysterio keeps rambling on about how like Peter Parker's ruining things and he's kind of destroying things and so on and so forth. And then he goes as far as to say, like, you have no idea what you're dealing with, right? You have no idea what I'm capable of. I missed out when you died the first time. I'm not going to miss out this time, right? So right off the bat, our cue is that this is some kind of ability from Mysterio to actually look through into the Ultimate Universe where that version of Peter Parker died. And Mysterio wants to be in that universe where Peter Parker doesn't exist, right? His main nemesis, the person that always foiled his plans, he's just trying to find a way to escape. And so what you end up getting here is Peter just kind of looking at this and saying like, what is this thing, right? Is this some kind of a power generator or whatever this is? It's weird that this is here, but like I can call people that can basically break this down and take this thing apart so we don't really have to worry about it, right? While Peter Parker doesn't really know what's going on with this device, he knows enough about Mysterio to know it's probably not a good thing, right? Like when supervillains start doing weird things that you don't understand, you can usually just assume it's bad, and you're not usually wrong in doing that. It's a good rule of thumb to have. But of course, in his desperation, Mysterio ends up grabbing a handgun and firing it off and then missing Peter Parker and hitting his device. And when that happens, he's yanked through, right? Peter is seemingly yanked through into basically the Ultimate Universe. And this is the first time, one of the reasons why this is so big, this is the very, very first time in the history of Marvel Comics that a character from the main Marvel Universe crossed over into the Ultimate Universe, right? This was a huge deal. Now, the Ultimate Universe, it exists now in Marvel Comics, but it's nowhere near as a big deal as it was back in like the early to mid 2000s, right? At around the time, and even really in the early 2010s when this story was written, this is when the Ultimate Universe was really kind of at its prime, depending on, you know, what you were reading. There was a lot of fall off after the death of Peter Parker. You know, we can't really, you know, that's just an absolute thing. We can't really argue that point. But the death of Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe actually made headlines, right? It made national news headlines. And so because of that, there was a lot of interest in the Ultimate Universe. And so it was really a great time to capitalize on that, right? To kind of give us this story. But this is a big deal when this first happened. And so as Peter Parker's there, he's like, okay, this is weird. Like it's suddenly daytime. I don't know what that great big huge building is over there. That's the Triskelion, that great big huge tower looking thing off in the water. You guys probably recognize the Triskelion from Captain America, the Winter Soldier. That's where this comes from. That's why we say the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a combination of the Ultimate Universe, the main Marvel Universe, and Earth 98, where the heroes age in real time. It's kind of a combination of those three things. But he ends up traveling back to the building where you had, you know, the whole you know, Mysterio's base of operations and everything popping off, and he basically ends up breaking into the place only to find out that it's occupied with some girl in a towel, and he's like, my bad. And basically bails out, right? Ends up taking off. From there, he actually ends up rescuing a guy who's, you know, kind of being beat up a little bit. He takes out the two people who were beating this dude up, and he basically says he was just playing pool, and then suddenly they jumped him. But the fact that he's wearing a Peter Parker costume, wearing a Spider-Man costume, does not go unnoticed by this guy. And he's like, look, I appreciate you saving me, but like, it's really in bad taste for you to wear that costume right now. What's more so than that, he's like, you know, we all need heroes, but that was Peter Parker's costume. And that's one of the big things to know. When Peter Parker died, and and even Peter Parker as Spider-Man, his identity was known, right? When all that popped off, his identity was known to the world. People were like, the world needs to know that this is the kid who tried to save everybody, who died a hero. That's why the death of Peter Parker was so massive in the Ultimate Universe, right? Like, imagine, for example, that like in the main Marvel Universe, in Marvel Comics, that Iron Man dies, and it's this great big huge event that crosses over every single comic that they have, right? It's like the death of Iron Man, you know, the Incredible Hulk tie-in and the Captain America tie-in and all that kind of stuff, right? Like everything ties into just the fact that Iron Man died and how everybody's coping with it. That's what the death of Peter Parker was. It was just huge. It was massive because Spider-Man had never actually been killed off in Marvel Comics with no intention of bringing him back, right? That's just never happened before, right? I mean, Marvel kind of tried it with the Clone Saga, but like, nah, it was never gonna happen. With the Ultimate Universe, it's the way it is. Peter Parker's been dead. You know, he's like the Peter Parker Spider-Man concept is dead, and Miles Morales had taken it over and has been that way ever since. So it was kind of a big deal. It was a huge deal when it happened. But this guy, the fact that this guy reveals that they know who Peter Parker is really throws like the main Marvel Universe Peter Parker off, because his identity is something that he keeps insanely close guarded. Right now, in Civil War, he revealed it to the world just as kind of a proof of the fact that he trusted Iron Man's superhero registration. But of course, as we saw in the aftermath of that Brand New Day, that Doctor Strange came along and just magicked everybody's memory of Peter Parker's identity out of their heads, right? He's just like, you magic, and then nobody remembered that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and that was essentially it, right? That was basically it. That's probably what they're going to end up doing in Spider-Man 3, the movie. But the whole point behind this is that this throws Peter Parker for a loop, because he's kind of like, okay, that's crazy. Like, wherever it is, they're referring to me in the third person. So one, this guy doesn't know who I am, but he knows who Peter Parker is. So that means there was a Peter Parker here in this place. What in the world is going on right now? And so what ends up happening is he's ultimately met by the arrival of Miles Morales. And Miles Morales pops up and he's just like, no way, right? Because to the eyes of Miles Morales, this is the Ultimate Universe version of Peter Parker. It's like Peter Parker has come back. That's what kind of blew things off, right? That's what makes Miles Morales kind of go nuts here. Okay, so we are picking back up again with Spider-Man Part 2, and this week we're going to kind of run through a whole bunch of Spider-Man related content, mostly because of the fact that the new Spider-Man game's coming out. We kind of want to be done in time for all of that stuff. But in this one, we pick up with Part 2. Right now, again, for those of you guys who are just joining us here, Spider-Man is the first time that Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe meets Miles Morales, the new Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe, right? This was a big deal when it first came out. Now, we ended up having this happening by way of the fact that Mysterio had basically managed to create some kind of interdimensional portal. And the result was that when Peter Parker came upon it and he ended up fighting Mysterio, Peter Parker ended up being thrown through, right? He was kind of sucked through more than anything else, but Peter Parker passed through it and ended up in the Ultimate Universe. What this does is it wakes up with Mysterio in the aftermath of that. Now, as soon as Mysterio comes to, his immediate response is, really, bro? He's incredibly pissed off, right? Because he's just like, this is the worst thing. Now, it's not like super complicated or anything. That's one of the great things about Brian Michael Bendis when he was writing really Ultimate Spider-Man and Miles Morales Spider-Man. I always say Bendis is better when he's writing kids or teenagers. When it comes to adults, he's not that good, but with kids or teenagers, he's amazing, right? So writing Miles Morales, he was super good at it. But the idea behind this is that from Mysterio's perspective, he does not want to run into another situation where Peter Parker exists. That him basically stumbling across the Ultimate Universe was a universe where Peter Parker Spider-Man didn't really exist. Peter Parker had never heard of Mysterio. And so with, him, really presuming that Miles Morales, that he knew Miles existed, that Miles could be somebody he could overcome pretty quickly, right? Because by and large, when it comes to Marvel Comics, villains from the main Marvel Universe are usually more powerful than villains from the Ultimate Universe, and even main characters themselves. Even somebody like the Phoenix Force or like Thor or Loki, they're really powerful characters in relation to their Ultimate Universe counterparts, because the Ultimate Universe was designed to be more toned down and realistic. Even in the realm of comic books, if you're writing a character and really a series of stories that exist as close as you can get to the real world, you probably don't want to really see these wild flights of fantasy when it comes to ridiculous levels of power, right? Like the Marquis of Death, different things like that. But the whole idea here is that what you end up having is Mysterio, who basically kind of brings out this kind of avatar. And this is basically a version of himself, kind of a robotic version of himself that can go into the Ultimate Universe in his stead, right? Because if you're Mysterio, you don't want to get yourself killed going into the Ultimate Universe. You send a robot in your place. And so switching over to Peter and Miles, this is one of the interesting things here, albeit a little strange. And the reason why is because initially Peter doesn't know what to make of Miles, and Miles doesn't know what to make of Peter, right? He's like, what in the world's going going on. And Peter hasn't figured out that he's in the Ultimate Universe because he doesn't know what the Ultimate Universe is. He just knows he's in some other place, right? And seemingly picking up pretty quickly on the fact that he's in some kind of an alternate dimension. And so because of this, there's a kind of fight that starts to break out between Peter and Miles, because Peter's like, okay, you're freaking me out, right? Because they keep going back and forth, right? Peter's like, what's the deal here? And Miles is like, you tell me. And Peter's is like, is it a clone thing? And he's like, what's a clone thing? And it's like, you tell me. He's like, I thought this was some kind of Nick Fury test. Is it a Nick Fury test? And Miles is like, you tell me. And it's like, just kind of going back and forth, right? So Peter gets frustrated, gets a little tussed, and ends up attacking Miles, right? Ends up going after Miles. But Miles, for his part, immediately dodges Spider-Man's webbing, right? And so from there, what you end up getting is this really interesting situation where Miles is able to bob and weave and duck all of Spider-Man's attacks and then counter proportionally. Now, this is where things get a little wonky, right? This is where things get a little... I don't know how I feel about that, right? Because keep in mind, Miles has not been formally trained by anybody at S.H.I.E.L.D. yet, right? In anybody in the Triskelion, by Nick Fury or any of those guys. And so he is still, in a lot of ways, flying by the seat of his pants. And so the fact that we're kind of getting this version of Miles who, over his time in being Spider-Man, is able to go toe-to-toe with Peter Parker, who's been playing this role for a very long time, and not only go toe-to-toe, manage to dodge his attacks and then shock him, is a little bit stunning here. But, no pun intended, is a little bit stunning here. But the funny thing about this, too, is we can also kind of play into it from Peter's perspective, that Peter is not fighting to like beat the crap out of Miles, right? He's not looking to like overcome Miles. He's looking to kind of subdue him, if anything else, right? Probably web him up or something like that. If Peter were fighting Miles in the same vein that he was fighting somebody like Rhino or like Dr. Octopus or somebody like that, the fight probably would have gone a much different way and it would have been over much, much faster. The reality is which way this fight would have gone depends on which character you like more. That's basically what it is, right? If you're a fan of Miles, you're like, oh, of course Miles could overcome Peter Parker. If you don't believe me, just ask me and I'll tell you. But if you're a fan of Peter Parker, it's the exact same thing, right? It's like, no, Peter Parker definitely could have gotten the upper hand on Miles, right? I mean, I know because I'm right? I mean, that's kind of how we as comic book fans get. We need no other evidence than our own opinion, and that's basically it. Now, the funny thing is, Miles actually goes to take the mask off Peter, which Miles should know by now is kind of a no-no. That's just something that you don't do. And that leads to Peter basically reacting, waking up and then kicking Miles off the ledge of the building, right? And then from there, Peter's like, dude, I think I just killed this kid. I think I just did this kid in. I do not need that on my conscience, right? I do not need this on my conscience. Now, unbeknownst to him, of course, Miles has initiated his invisibility power, but nonetheless, Peter's just kind of like, okay, I think I killed this kid. This is a problem. We got to find this kid, right? And then Miles pops back up, gets the upper hand on Peter, kicks him, and then of course, Peter ends up kind of spinning some webbing out. And then from there, he shoots his webbing into Miles' mask and yanks his mask off, right? And that's when he's kind of like, all right, here, it's time for you to come clean, right? Like, how are you, Spider-Man? What's going on here? Like, give me all the skin and give me all the information. Now, the response of Miles is, you have to give me my mask back, right? Like, anybody out here could see that I'm Spider-Man and I have to keep my family and my identity protected. Like, give me my mask back. Now, you would expect Peter to respond and say, yeah, I kind of understand where you're coming from. That's kind of my thing too. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and Peter needs information. The problem with this is he didn't really understand why Miles got the upper hand on him the first time, and so he didn't really even think about the Venom Blast this time, which Miles uses, channels it into the webbing, and then takes out Peter. It's genius. And that was one of the cool things that made Miles so interesting in the early comics, is when you were reading his character, you could actually watch him become a better Spider-Man as you were reading the comic. And so with every single story arc that you read, he was a better version of Spider-Man at the end of that story than he was before he started the story, right? It was really, really cool. But with regards to Peter, what you end up getting here is Miles basically using Peter's web shooters, right? To kind of swing them, down to the ground and then kind of get them onto a roof and then get them to safety. And when they collapse, right, he ends up taking the mask off Peter and he realizes, oh my God, this is Peter Parker. Now for him, he doesn't know this is Peter from the Marvel Universe, from the main Marvel Universe, right? He thinks it's like Peter Parker returned from his universe. So he's like, I have no idea what I do here, right? And that's when he kind of looks over to the Triskelion and Peter Parker's taken to the S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters, right? From there, he meets with Nick Fury. Now, most of the guys who read the Ultimate Universe know two things about Nick Fury. The first one is that he was based on Samuel L. Jackson, right? And in fact, Samuel L. Jackson actually threatened to sue Marvel, but they ended up letting him play the role of Nick Fury in the MCU. So the lawsuit never happened, right? That's why we got Samuel L. Jackson, Nick Fury. But the other thing about this is that Nick Fury is highly skeptical, right? He is a super suspicious guy. And so when he starts asking questions, when he starts asking him well, at least when he refers to him as Peter, and Peter's like, do you know me? And he's like, I know the name, and it's that kind of a thing. The two of them start talking to each other, and it's kind of a cool bit of a conversation here, right? Because Peter even makes reference to the fact that I know your eye patch, but it's one of these little tidbit things. But when he asks him are you Peter Parker? It's like, well, it's not that straightforward. And it's like, okay, well then give me an answer. Like, give me this one hypothetical answer that you have. And Peter basically reiterates his whole fight with Mysterio, then passing through the portal and then ending up here and all that kind of stuff. And Nick Fury's kind of like, huh, okay, I mean, I could probably buy that story. It's so far-fetched, it might just be true, right? It's one of those things. So he just kind of ends up giving Peter credibility here. Now, the reality of this is that Bendis does this just for the sake of keeping the story moving forward. Under any other comic in the Ultimate Universe, Nick Fury would be like, no, I'm not buying that. You're gonna stay in this cell until you tell me what's actually going on. And he would legitimately leave him there. Nick Fury would have done that if you sat down, if this happened in the Ultimates and it was anybody else besides Spider-Man, if it was Ultimates or like the Ultimate Fantastic Four or the Ultimate X-Men, Nick Fury would be like, no, man, I'm not buying into that nonsense, that crazy malarkey. I'm not buying into any of that stuff, right? So he would just leave him there. But Bendis does this for the sake of keeping the story moving forward. What he ends up doing is basically handing Peter over to Miles and say, okay, it's your all's job to go do your own thing, right? Your all's job to get this whole thing sorted out and find out what's going on. And so what Peter does is, by virtue of what Nick Fury told him, the way that Miles is acting, that kind of thing, he starts to put two and two together. And so what he does is he really kind of asks the big question, like, tell me, kid, in this universe, is Peter Parker dead, right? Is Peter Parker not alive here anymore? And that's what's kind of nuts, is because before Miles can really give him an answer and explain everything, both of them are shot through the helicopter by this avatar of Mysterio. And in turn, Miles basically saves both of them and then kind of takes both guys, or really takes him and the pilot down to their safety, right? But basically Mysterio's here and starts launching his attack against Peter and Miles. So this is when we go from Miles Morales meeting Peter Parker to Miles fighting Peter to Miles and Peter teaming up. All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with Spider-Man. I almost said Spider-Man 2. With Spider-Man, we're picking back up with Miles Morales and Peter Parker. Now, this is kind of a three-pronged event, right? Like the first time, in the first issue they met, and the second issue they fought, and this one they team up. So it's kind of a cool bit of storytelling here, right? But in the instance where they had initially fought each other and things had kind of popped off, and they were sort of coming to terms, and you know, with regards to this reality, they're suddenly met by this avatar of Mysterio. Now, again, this is kind of the robot slash, you know, well, really just straight robot that Mysterio is using. He is in the main Marvel universe, but he's piloting this and it's moving around in the Ultimate Universe, right? And so because of that, as soon as it takes down the helicopter that Peter Parker and Miles Morales were in, the two of them start to team up to fight Mysterio. The problem with this is that Miles Morales has never really fought anybody like Mysterio before. And even Mysterio, as he exists in the main Marvel universe, doesn't really exist the same way in the Ultimate Universe. To kind of give you guys some perspective of the big differences between these two things, because I believe by this point Doctor Strange is dead, there came a point in the Ultimate Universe where Doctor Strange fought Dormammu. And in the main Marvel Universe, Doctor Strange has fought Dormammu a multitude of times and won pretty much every single time. In the Ultimate Universe, he fights him once and dies. It's nuts. Like, he's painfully outclassed in comparison to the power that Dormammu has. Like, he kills him with a quickness, and that's basically it, right? That it happens so incredibly fast. Because you're talking about Mysterio, who still maintained his ability to create illusions despite using a kind of avatar form, you end up having Peter Parker, who picks up on what's going on. Now, it took him a moment to realize it, because he's like, something weird is going on, right? It's a more powerful strain of the illusion that he normally uses, but what he ends up doing is conjuring all of Spider-Man's villains and the things that Miles Morales fears the most, right? So basically, their greatest fears between the two of them. And with this happening, you really only ever see the Scorpion from the Ultimate Universe. You see Uncle Aaron, the Prowler from the Ultimate Universe, and Omega Red from the Ultimate Universe, but you only really see those because those are only really the villains that Miles Morales has fought so far. For Peter Parker, it's a whole host of stuff, right? It's a whole host of things, Green Goblin and Dr. Octopus and all that stuff. But that's what makes it so bonkers, is because of the fact that Miles doesn't really know how to navigate this. Now, this kind of illusion that Mysterio creates, that's one of the big things to understand. His illusions can be tangible. If they're powerful enough, they can be tangible. And that's one of the big differences, is that in the early days, if I remember correctly, in the early days, his illusions were more or less intangible, right? So he could trick you into believing you were somewhere, but he couldn't really make things interact with you. In this instance, he can, and it's really kind of been that way for a number of years in Marvel Comics. But Mysterio uses his powers to quite literally have these guys attack Miles Morales and Spider-Man and Peter Parker, right? So it's like Venom and it's Carnage, it's all these guys. And this is incredibly dangerous because these are forces that Miles isn't used to facing off against. But this is one of the big differences here, is that Miles hasn't really faced off against Mysterio before, but at the same time, this kind of magic doesn't necessarily exist inside the Ultimate Universe. Now, this may seem like it would naturally work against Miles Morales. He's basically being exposed to something that he hasn't really seen before and wouldn't really know how to navigate those waters. But instead of doing what Peter Parker seems to be doing here, which is kind of overthinking it to a degree, instead, Miles actually manages to get the upper hand and basically incapacitate Mysterio temporarily, you know, if for no other reason than to basically take down his avatar form and then essentially destroy it, right? Like destroy that body, because Miles picks up on the fact this is the reason why it's happening. Now, again, this is one of those instances in the Ultimate Spider-Man comics where people were a little finicky. They were like, I mean, I have a hard time believing that Miles would be able to pick up on this and Peter Parker couldn't. You're talking about two characters from two different realities who navigate waters differently. When this story first came out, there was one group of people who looked at this and said, okay, the only reason Miles is able to figure this out on his own is because Bendis is writing it, and Bendis is pushing Miles and really wants him to be like the new Ultimate Universe Spider-Man. And of what use would his character be if he didn't have some kind of caveat over Peter Parker from, Peter Parker in general, right? Even from the main Marvel universe. It's one of these interesting concepts, one of these interesting quagmires. But again, with regards to Mysterio, he's one of these villains where by all standards of measurement, he would have gotten the upper hand on Miles Morales, because what makes Mysterio's, his powers so incredibly potent is he's much like Mastermind or somebody like Charles Xavier. Not in so much as the powers he possesses, he's just an illusionist, right? He doesn't really have telepathy or anything like that. But much like those guys, his powers can totally envelope you and convince you that you're somewhere that you're not, right? Mysterio gets his hands on you, he can convince you that you're a world away, and you're in, some pirate land and you're fighting against pirates or something like that. Whether or not you're able to actually pick up on that are two distinctly different things, right? Creating that illusion, if you're of sound mind, you'll immediately know that something's off, right? Regardless, when everything kind of pops off, Peter Parker actually ends up taking off. He doesn't leave the universe, he just goes to explore it. And what you end up having are the Ultimates who arrive here on the scene with Miles Morales. Now, one of the big things that goes on here is, again, because these characters were designed to be a lot more toned down than the versions that we saw in the Ultimate Universe, that Tony Stark doesn't really know how to navigate this technology, right? Like in the main Marvel Universe, he would have picked it up right off the bat and just been like, okay, so here's what's going on with this. Instead, in the Ultimate Universe, his intelligence is a little more grounded, right? So it's not as though he's just wildly out there as intelligent as the story needs him to be. Instead, it's a little more grounded here. So he recognized it insofar as it's an exceedingly, advanced form of technology, and that it's an avatar that's basically being used by, this Mysterio guy to control this avatar version from someplace else. But in terms of being able to reverse engineer it almost instantaneously, that doesn't happen here, right? That doesn't really take place here. Now, for Miles' part, of course, he ends up asking Nick Fury, where'd the other Spider-Man go? And Fury's response is, he went out there to explore things. And that's the nature of this, right? When you're someone like Spider-Man and you face off against Mysterio and you've gone through his illusions so many times, the biggest struggle he has here is trying to figure out whether any of this is real or false. That's the biggest struggle he has at the moment, because you got to kind of think of this from Peter's perspective. He was in his own universe, he was facing off against Mysterio, found himself yanked through a portal, ended up in this new reality where he's dead, there's a new Spider-Man that took his place, and that there's a Nick Fury there, who seemingly allowed the two of them to team up, and then Mysterio's avatar appears, he ends up facing off against all of his villains, even though they're illusions, and then of course Miles Morales ends up destroying that avatar, and now Peter's basically exploring. In his mind, all of this could be the illusion, and that's the truth of the thing, right? That's the truth of the thing here. When you're facing off against Mysterio, this could all be illusion. It's entirely possible that Bendis could have ended this story and it was all just one great huge illusion created by Mysterio, and it would work. It would be believable because he's done it before, right? That's the advancement of Mysterio's illusions, is that it screws with your head so incredibly badly. But as we know, Peter Parker is actually in the Ultimate Universe. And so he basically starts tracking different things down, right? He goes to the place that would have been his apartment. He ends up finding a corner store. He asks her, like, how long has this been here? She's like, I don't know. How long have you worked here? I've worked here 2 years, and he's like, okay, so there was never an apartment building here. There was never an apartment here. And so basically he never stayed here. The other thing that ends up happening after he, beats up some guy who runs into the place and robs it, is he asks her for a tablet that can help him access the internet. And when he does, he finds an article that the Spider-Man in this universe really did die here, and that everybody really knew that he was Peter Parker, that he was a high school student from Queens. And so it's one of these things where it's kind of like, I really am in a universe where I'm dead. The other part of that is, of course, she has this little necklace around her neck, and of course it's her way of paying respects to Peter Parker as Spider-Man. And then he's like, you need to tell me exactly what happened to Peter Parker in this universe. And so what we end up doing is we basically end up picking up some period of time later with Aunt May and with Gwen Stacy from the Ultimate Universe, and Peter Parker shows up on their doorstep, right? Like literally just shows up there. And this is one of the most amazing things here. This is one of the most amazing moments, because this is Peter Parker coming to grips with Gwen Stacy, who is still alive in this universe, and Aunt May, and having to face the fact that in their mind, he's dead. And so it's kind of like, wow, like this is one of those things, it's a hyper emotional story if you're a Peter Parker fan, right? It's kind of nuts. It's Peter Parker re-encountering Aunt May and Gwen Stacy. It's kind of nuts. Okay, we're picking back up again with Spider-Man, which is the conclusion of the story where Peter Parker meets Miles Morales for the very, very first time, right? Peter Parker from the main Marvel Universe meets the Ultimate Spider-Man, Miles Morales. And the whole idea behind this is that we pick up with Peter Parker following his kind of encounter alongside Miles with Mysterio, who basically used a kind of robot version of himself to move into the Ultimate Universe or to travel to the Ultimate Universe. Peter Parker has essentially traveled to meet the Ultimate Universe's version of Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane Watson. Now keep in mind, the last time they saw Spider-Man, it was their version of Peter Parker and he died. And largely there was just kind of the grieving process that went into it. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the early Miles Morales comics that we did is that there did come a point when Miles took on the Spider-Man costume and was met by Aunt May and Gwen Stacy. And they were kind of like, look, if you're gonna do this, understand that you're living up to a legacy much bigger than yourself, right? You don't just simply put on the Spider-Man costume and do your thing. You're living up to the legacy that my nephew created, and you stand for everything he stood for. So this is not a thing to take lightly, right? So it was kind of, initially they were against it, but it's one of these things where it's kind of like, okay, you know, we can sort of get on board once they realize the character of Miles Morales and what he had to offer. But the problem with this is that when Peter shows up, he's wearing the original Spider-Man costume. And as soon as Aunt May sees this, she gets pissed, right? Because he basically showed his face. And her thought is that it's some kind of a joke, right? Gwen Stacy shows up and starts kicking the crap out of Peter Parker, thinking that he's pulling a stunt too. And it's not until Miles shows up and says, no, it's really actually Peter, right? It's not somebody pulling a trick or something like that, not somebody being a jerk. I don't really know of a reasonable human being that would show up on the doorstep of a woman and like basically two chicks who lost somebody close to them dressed as that person, right? I mean, if somebody were to do that, I would I would stand by and just watch them get the crap kicked out of them. I'd record it and then just be like, yeah, man, this guy kind of had it coming. Like, that'd be my response. I'd be like, yeah, man, like they were kind of a dick. They sort of had this coming, right? Nobody do anything. Let them get their just desserts. But this is actually Peter, right? This is actually Peter Parker here. And when Miles comes to his rescue, that's when Aunt May and Gwen Stacy basically start to listen, right? And Peter's initial response is like I thought initially I died. I thought something happened. Like I didn't really know what was going on, how I ended up here. You know, I've only recently been putting the pieces together. I never should have come here, right? I never should have come here to this place. You know, I'm sorry I did this to you. And then basically Aunt May passes out, right? Now at that point, we switch over to the Ultimate Universe Tony Stark and Nick Fury, right? Now Nick Fury we've talked about before. Ultimate Universe Iron Man, we've never really had a big discussion about. One of the big things to understand here is that Ultimate Iron Man, when he first showed up, was designed to be a more grounded version of Tony Stark from the main Marvel Universe, right? So not as intelligent, because even Tony in the main Marvel Universe, his intelligence, even for the realm of comics, borderline's questionable, right? Like how could a person possibly be that smart? This version of Tony is really smart, but he is a version of intelligence we would expect to see here in the real world, right? Hence the nature of the Ultimate Universe, kind of reflection of the real world the way it exists now. And so he's not really able to pick up or really figure out what Mysterio, what's going on with Mysterio's character, right? How to reverse engineer the circuitry, where the signal's coming from, any, you know, all that kind of stuff. The reality of this is there's an infinite number of universes out there, right? And Tony just doesn't have the ability to trace his signal back to its origin point. Now, if this were in the main Marvel Universe, the main Marvel Tony Stark would have figured it out like that, right? He would have figured it out so fast because it's what the story called for. But the idea of the Ultimate Universe was to write more realistic stories, right? And really, if you're talking about an infinite number of universes, there really wouldn't be a way to trace the signal all the way back to its origin point, because it's not like it's a rope that leads from the main Marvel Universe and all they have to do is just follow the breadcrumbs to get to its location. It doesn't really work that way, at least not for anybody here. And so at the end of the day, Tony doesn't really have any answers here. He's like, the only way for me to really get some answers is to talk to that alternate reality version of Spider-Man, to talk to Peter Parker. It's the only way for me to really figure out what it is that's going on here. Now, the funny comment he makes is, I'm surprised that you let Miles Morales run around with Peter Parker, right? I figured you would have cracked him over the head, thrown him into a hole, and basically grabbed like the main Peter and done the same thing, right? Kind of, you know, kept Miles Morales under wraps so that he wouldn't really have any idea what's going on, and then basically took Peter and just kind of locked him up. But the idea behind this is that Fury really feels a bit of, you know, regret when it comes to Peter, right? Peter was never properly trained to become a superhero. He was never properly trained. He was never really inducted the way that he was supposed to be. He was just kind of allowed to do his thing. And that led to his eventual death. And Nick Fury felt a lot of responsibility for that. That's why when you go and you read Cataclysm, there's a lot of focus put on Nick Fury and the guilt he feels for the death of Peter Parker, because when he could have trained him or he could have helped him to become a better hero, he didn't. Instead, it was just kind of him doing his thing. And so with that guilt in mind, along with promises that he made, it's kind of like, we're just going to let them work it out together, right? Which is actually the right move. The best move for Nick Fury to make is really for Peter, Aunt May, Gwen Stacy to all kind of come to terms with this on their own. And so once Aunt May wakes up, you basically have Peter like telling stories, you know, to Miles and to Gwen Stacy, them sharing stories stories with him, that kind of a thing, and kind of going back and forth, right? And Peter's coming to this realization there's massive differences between this reality and the one that he's from. Now, we as the reader know that. One of the funny things that goes on is Gwen Stacy kind of starts poking and prodding and is like, is there a version of me in your universe? And Peter's like, yeah, but she's a little bit older than you are. You know, she's about my age. And she's like, well, I mean, you know, like, are you dating her? And Peter's like, I mean, not really. Like, I'm basically dating Mary Jane Watson, right? Which is what Gwen Stacy calls. And then as soon as this kind of explanation goes on that Mary Jane is like a supermodel, which she's not in the Ultimate Universe, right? She's just like a nerdy girl. And when it's like she's a supermodel and all that kind of stuff, like Gwen Stacy's kind of shocked to find out that like Mary Jane Watson is this hugely popular, world-renowned model. And it's kind of like, wow, that's a little crazy. But when she starts asking, what about me, right? Like, what am I then? Like, what's going on with me? Peter's like, we should probably talk about something else. I don't have the heart to tell you that the Green Goblin threw you off a bridge and I shot my webbing at your foot and broke your neck in the process, because that's basically what happened. I don't care what anybody says. She was not dead before Spider-Man got there. I don't care what anybody says. But, you know, it's kind of an interesting thing because it's like there are parts of his reality he doesn't really want to divulge, because who knows how Gwen Stacy would react if it was like, well, you're dead and I'm the reason why. Then it's kind of like, get out of this house, right? You know, I don't want you here. But it's really kind of new to her to learn, or really fascinating for her to learn that there's whole other worlds and dimensions out there. Now, for her part, Aunt May is a lot more reserved here, right? She's not nearly as excited as Gwen Stacy is. You know, she's kind of bracing herself with the idea that it's not actually Peter Parker. That it's like, well, we don't really know if it's Peter Parker. We don't really know if it's him, right? We don't know if that's the case. It could be somebody else pretending to be him. Now, in fact, like, it really is him. We know that. Miles Morales believes it. Gwen Stacy believes it. But Aunt May's doing this because in her heart of hearts, if she gives into this and then it turns out to be false, she'd lose it, right? Like, it would just be the most crushing experience. Because for her, when she kind of asks Peter, you know, what led you to become this person, right? When he kind of starts talking to her about like Uncle Ben's the reason why he does this, that Uncle Ben, of course, is dead in his reality. But the fact that he could have saved Uncle Ben and he didn't is the reason why he became a superhero the way that he did. And the idea that he could basically help other people and in a lot of ways atone for his past mistake. He basically runs off the statement, with great power, and then she finishes it, comes great responsibility. Now it should be, must come great responsibility. The fact that this is a lesson that Peter was taught by Uncle Ben tells Aunt May everything she needs to know, that it really is him. And that's what she kind of gives herself over and says, we thought like we lost you, right? We lost you and we didn't even get to say goodbye. And that's the important thing here, right? That's the important thing to understand. That's why Aunt May kept herself reserved in this part, right? Because if she had said like, okay, yeah, you're probably Peter, and let her whole self believe it, and then it turned out to just be some alternate reality version of Peter who was evil or something like that, but it wasn't like this alternate reality counterpart to the one that she knew, which is to say a good guy who fights the good fight and does what heroes do, then it would have broken her in her entirety, right? Like the inability of her to say goodbye, the chance that the fact that she never got to tell Peter that she was proud of him, that she loved him, right? To never say, like, to never be able to say, I'm sorry, or any of that stuff, right? To basically like confess or to kind of get to say her last goodbyes to him is something that's always haunted her. Having Peter here, this alternate reality version of Peter, even though she knows it's not her actual nephew, she knows it's not the Peter Parker from the Ultimate Universe, gives her a chance to effectively say goodbye, right? To say her goodbyes and you know, indirectly say it to Peter Parker from Ultimate Universe to give her closure. It's basically what this does, something that she's never had this entire time. And so Miles Morales, looking out the window, realizes, okay, S.H.I.E.L.D.'s on their way, we need to go, right? Because S.H.I.E.L.D. is a lot more seedy in the Ultimate Universe than they are in the main Marvel Universe. In the main Marvel Universe, they're still kind of jerks, but like they're more inclined to work with you than against you. In the Ultimate Universe, they're like a police force almost, right? I mean, not specifically, but in terms of like how they function, right? Like they do their thing, and all there are just people who stand in the way is basically all that it is. But of course, Peter ends up saying goodbye to everybody here, and then of course he ends up getting in the car with Nick Fury, Miles Morales, and it's kind of a funny thing because Nick Fury asks like, is there a Nick Fury where you come from? And he's like, yeah, but he's kind of a white guy. And then like Nick Fury's like, sorry to hear that, man. Which is kind of a funny thing. But again, it gives Aunt May the closure she needs. And that's why when the story came out, it was so huge. It was wrapping up all these plot threads, right? All these little things that have been left hanging. And the reality is that if anybody but Brian Michael Bendis had taken this over, we probably would have never seen this, right? But Bendis started off with the Ultimate Spider-Man. He originally created it. It makes sense that he would basically end it here and kind of continue things on with Miles. And that's why Spider-Man is so important. It's one part wrapping up plot threads that Bendis never got to wrap up after the death of Peter Parker in the Ultimate universe and the Cataclysm story, and it was a way to kind of officially transition into Miles. And we'll find more, find out more why that's the case once we get to the end of this. But when he really meets with Tony Stark, he's kind of like, okay, so there's a few differences here. Like, one, the Tony Stark in my universe stopped drinking a while ago, which Nick Fury loves, and two, it's obvious this guy's not as smart. And so with Tony kind of being like, look, like, I need to know where his home is. I need to know where your universe is. When Peter starts to point him in that direction, then it turns into, okay, then we could at the very least figure out how to get you back, right? We could figure out how to reverse engineer this stuff. Now, make no mistake, Tony Stark's not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. Tony Stark's doing this, one part because he was directed by Nick Fury, but two, because he can get something out of it, right? I mean, this is a level of technology that Tony just doesn't have access to. Being able to attain this technology and use it for his own ends is a huge benefit, right? It's something that he desperately wants here. And so once they're basically looking at the broadcast that Mysterio's been putting out, over the internet, all day long and for how many days he's been here, Miles picks up on the fact that one of these buildings is actually in Brooklyn, right? He's like, one of these buildings is in Brooklyn. I'm familiar with it. And so they know exactly where it is Mysterio is operating out of, right? They know his base of operations. Once they locate that, Nick Fury calls in everyone. And when I say everyone, I mean an entire S.H.I.E.L.D. strike team alongside Spider-Man and alongside the Ultimate Thor. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with the conclusion of Spider-Man. Yes, we are. We are wrapping up the Spider-Man event, and this is probably the single most important part of the story. Not necessarily because of what's happened so far, but because of the future of Miles Morales. So what we end up doing here is we initially pick up with Mysterio, and Mysterio is suffering from the same problem that every supervillain suffers from: stupidity. So the idea behind this with Mysterio, is that he comes to the realization that he actually unintentionally defeated Spider-Man. That with Spider-Man being whisked off into this other dimension where Peter Parker in that reality is dead, that it leaves no Spider-Man in this universe, right? In the main Marvel universe. There is no Peter Parker here, right? He's off in the Ultimate Universe somewhere. And it was something that Mysterio had not really thought of before. And now he realizes it, like, man, dude, okay, like, I actually defeated Spider-Man. But then the question becomes, why isn't it enough? Right? Like, why is it not enough? He's like, I have to see it, right? I have to see him suffer and die. I'll just take a peek for myself just for one moment. Now, this is Brian Michael Bendis being Brian Michael Bendis. If it were me writing the story, it would be like, oh man, dude, I won, cool, the end. And that would be it, right? It would be Mysterio realizing he basically got the upper hand on Peter Parker and there's no more Spider-Man here. Such as it is, Bendis wanted to tell the story. And so basically Mysterio comes to the realization that he wants to actually see Spider-Man suffer and die. And so he basically reactivates the portal and takes a peek inside, only for webbing to come flying out and to basically attach itself to him. And then of course you have Peter Parker, you have Miles Morales, and the Ultimates team who's there, right? The Ultimate Avengers who are all there. And it's kind of like, well, crap, right? Like, well, damn, like that's basically it, right? Like, okay, I mean, who could have possibly seen that coming? The cool thing about this though, is that one thing to understand with Mysterio is he's usually always got an ace up his sleeve. And that's one of the things that makes him so dangerous, right? And so where you have Nick Fury, you've got the rest of the guys who are kind of like, cool, the day's saved. Keep in mind, they're not used to the kind of villains you have in the main Marvel universe where somehow they always have some kind of an escape plan or something like that. Remember, the main Marvel universe is a lot less realistic than the Ultimate Universe was. And so Mysterio immediately types away and just starts releasing a whole host of these chemicals and sets off an explosion. And when that happens, basically everybody here, so like Iron Man, Nick Fury, Miles Morales, all these various guys are met by what are essentially their worst nightmares, right? That's literally what they're exposed to. Using the power of Mysterio, he exposes all of them to their worst nightmares, right? So you've got all the Ultimates who are dead at the hands of Tony Stark, which of course is definitely an allusion to what we saw in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You've got Nick Fury who's watching the world on fire, watching the world burn. Green Goblin has killed Aunt May in front of, really Dr. Octopus and Green Goblin have killed Aunt May in front of Spider-Man. And then you've got the Prowler who killed Miles Morales' mother and father. And so because of that, where everybody else is kind of succumbing to this, Miles sort of succumbs to it a little bit, but then manages to get the upper hand on it, even if only for a moment. And when that happens, he realizes Mysterio's making a break for the portal and he tackles Mysterio. Now, by all standards of measurement, Miles should have been 100% incapacitated here. And again, that's kind of the critique of Bendis, right? Bendis is just, well, of course Miles Morales has to be on top. He's the guy that I'm writing right now. He's the main Spider-Man. We can't have him lose, right? So it's kind of like, okay, it's sort of, you just kind of go with it in this story, right? It's just kind of the way that Bendis does it. But where you end up having Mysterio, who of course uses his powers on Miles yet again, he almost gets the upper hand. Miles dodges the attack, goes invisible, and then Mysterio Mysterio, trying to figure out what happens, ends up being attacked by Miles again. Now, again, this is kind of Bendis basically saying like, this is how capable Miles is. Now, the reality of this is that while this was kind of, I wouldn't say far-fetched, but kind of like, what in the world's going on here? You know, back in the day, in this day and age, it's common practice, and it kind of makes sense. I think that with this story and Miles being able to overcome Mysterio so fast, despite Mysterio's abilities, was really more of just Bendis wanting to tell the story, as opposed to just kind of letting it play out organically. In reality, having somebody like Mysterio was probably not the best bet. It probably should have been somebody more like Dr. Octopus, because Mysterio's powers are not limited to just some kind of tentacles attached to his back that go after you, that he messes with your mind, he messes with your head. And so there isn't really a whole lot of reason to believe that Miles would somehow be able to overcome this so quickly, right? If you're trying to maintain that kind of comic book lore that we're used to and kind of maintain consistency, then, you know, it's something that you would kind of expect. But with Peter Parker able to overcome it as well, alongside Miles, they take out Mysterio pretty quickly, right? He's defeated pretty fast. And so from that point, what they end up doing is actually keeping Mysterio inside the Ultimate Universe. And the reason why is because Mysterio now knows that Peter Parker's Spider-Man. And so it kind of creates this situation where Peter's like, okay, cool, yeah, man, hold on to him. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks for looking out. It's kind of a shady thing to do, but this is really the most important moment that comes out of this, right? Which is why we kind of more or less ham-fisted our way through this. There's a point where Peter and Miles are talking, and Peter basically thanks him for keeping the legacy of Spider-Man going. And when Miles asks him, like, does that mean that I have your blessing? Peter's like, absolutely. This was Brian Michael Bendis giving a big middle finger to the naysayers. And we talked about that before, that when Miles first showed up, there were a lot of people who were really pissy about the fact that Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe had been killed. And they didn't want Miles, they wanted Peter Parker. The response of Bendis is, you already have Peter Parker. You've had him for like 50 years, right? You've had Peter Parker for a long, long time. You need to get over yourselves, right? It's time for a new Spider-Man. It's time to kind of continue on this story, focusing on somebody else. We can't do that in the main Marvel Universe because Peter Parker is etched in stone forevermore, the Spider-Man in the main Marvel Universe. We can't change that. Marvel editorial won't let me change it, and even if I wanted to, it'd be a terrible idea to do it anyway. But in the Ultimate Universe, I created this character. Bendis giveth, Bendis taketh away. And that's kind of his stance on that. And so when you had a lot of people who were giving him flack and really complaining a lot on the various forum boards and social media, different things like that, about Miles Morales taking over the role of Spider-Man in the Ultimate Universe, this was really Bendis saying, no, he's not going anywhere, right? If what you expected me to do was to basically give in, acquiesce, and admit defeat and say, hey, you know, you 50 comic book fans who sound like 5 million, obviously you guys don't like Miles Morales, so let me just get rid of him and bring back Peter Parker. If that's what you were expecting, then I'm sorry, you're gravely mistaken. That's not what's going to happen. And so we ended up just getting Miles Morales going forward. And so it's one of these things where with Miles kind of getting the official blessing of Peter Parker, that you have this moment where Nick Fury kind of pulls him aside and says, you got his blessing, man. Like, you earned it, kid, right? If that Spider-Man, the real true Spider-Man, gives you his blessing, then you're good, right? Just go forward and do your superhero thing. So it's really not anymore of Nick Fury kind of questioning Miles anymore, kind of looking at him with a skewed eye, or really the only eye you can look at him with, and just kind of, you know, his one good eye, kind of look at him with a skewed eye, and then just kind of being like, is he really gonna be a good Spider-Man? At this point, you know, he kind of goes forward with a whole new level of confidence that he didn't really have before. And that's kind of a cool thing, because what you do is you switch over to Peter Parker himself back home, right back in his own apartment. He's like, Miles Morales, Miles Morales. I wonder if we have a Miles Morales in the main Marvel Universe. And then it ends. Now, of course, we know, as far as I'm aware, that's not true in Marvel Comics, right? The story was told like 8 years ago, so we know that's not really true. At the time this was written, everybody wanted to know if it was true or not. It was like the biggest cliffhanger of like a decade, right? Like, I wonder if they really do have a Miles Morales in the main Marvel Universe. And it's like, I wonder what's gonna happen with that, right? It's kind of crazy, but it is a cool story. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Did you guys enjoy Spider-Man, the very first story, the very first time where Peter Parker and Miles Morales meet one another? Let me know what you guys think. I'm kind of curious what your all stance is. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.